Garfield, read by Jasper Britton. He was called Smith and was 12 years old, which in itself was a marvel, for it seemed as if the smallpox, the consumption, brain fever, jail fever, and even the hangman's rope had given him a wide berth for fear of catching something. Or else they weren't quick enough. Smith had a turn of speed that was remarkable, and a neatness in nipping down an alley or vanishing in a court that had to be seen to be believed. Not that it was often seen, for Smith inhabited the tumble-down mazes about Fat St. Paul's like the subtle air itself. A rat was like a snail beside Smith, and the most his 1,000 victims ever got of him was the powerful whiff of his passing and a cold draught in their dexterously emptied pockets. Only the sanctimonious birds that perched on the church's dome ever saw Smith's progress entire, and as their beady eyes followed him, they chattered savagely, "Pickpocket, pickpocket, jug, jug, jug him," as if they'd been appointed by the town to save it from such as Smith. His favourite spot was Ludgate Hill, where the world's coaches and sedan chairs were locked from morning to night in a horrible, blasphemous confusion. And here, in one or other of the ancient doorways, he leaned and grinned while the shouting and cursing and raging went endlessly on, till, sooner or later, something prosperous would come his way. At about 10:30 of a cold December morning, an old gentleman got furiously out of his carriage, in which he'd been trapped for an hour, shook his red fist at his helpless coachman, and began to stump up Ludgate Hill. A country gentleman, judging by his complexion, his clean, old-fashioned coat, and his broad-legged, lumbering walk, which bumped out his pockets in a manner most provoking. Smith twitched his nose and nipped neatly along like a shadow. The old man's pace was variable. Sometimes it was brisk for his years, then he'd slow down, hesitate, look about him, as if the town had changed much since last he'd visited, and he was now no longer confident of his way. On went the old gentleman deeper and deeper into the musty, tottering forest of the town, where Smith hunted fastest and best. Now a sharpish wind sprang up, and the cathedral birds eyed the leaden sky, screeched, and flew to the lower eminence of Old Bailey. Here they set up a terrific commotion with their legal brethren, till both church and law became absorbed in watching the progress of Smith. "Pickpocket, pickpocket, jug, jug, jug him!" The old gentleman was very deep in Smith's country now, and paused many a time to peer down the shambling lanes and alleys. Then he'd shake his head vaguely and touch at his coat pocket, as if a queer, deep sense had warned him of a pair of sharp eyes fairly cutting into the cloth like scissors. At last he saw something familiar. Some landmark he'd remembered, Godliman Street. The old gentleman began to stump very particularly down Godliman Street, eyeing the old crumbly houses. Now came a slit between two such properties, a quiet way roofed over at first-floor level. Curtis Alley, leading to Curtis Court. "Beg pardon, sir, beg pardon." Out of a doorway on the left of the court came Smith, which was the first time the old man had ever laid eyes on him, though all the way from Ludgate Hill there'd never been more than 2 yards between them. He stopped, flustered, about 6 paces from the end of the alley. Which way was the damned urchin going? This way, that way? Angrily he shifted, and Smith, with a quaint clumsiness, brushed against him, and it was done. In an instant. Smith halted. Footsteps in the alley. It would be blocked. He changed direction as briefly as a speck in the wind, and vanished back into the doorway. But so quickly that seconds after he'd disappeared, the old gentleman was still staggering and bewildered. Out of the alley came 2 men in brown, curious fellows of a very particular aspect, which Smith knew well. They moved very neat. They were proficient in their trade. The taller came at the old man from the front. The other took on his back and slid a knife into it. The old gentleman's face was fatefully towards a certain dark doorway. His eyes flickered with pain at the knife's quick prick. Then he looked surprised, amazed even, as he felt the cold blade slip into his warm heart. His last sight on this earth was of a small, wild, and despairing face, whose flooded eyes shone out of the shadows with all the dread and pity they were capable of. In a terror as violent as his dislike, Smith watched the two men in brown. They were dragging the luckless old gentleman towards the darkness of the alley. Now he could hear the quick fumbling sounds of searching. Oh, they knew what they were at. But the sounds grew harsh and hasty, even irritable. Came a new sound. A very queer one. A tapping, limping, scraping sound, as of a lame man's footsteps on the cobbles. Then, well, nothing, Your Honour. Liars, fools, look again. Again the sounds of searching, accompanied by strained, indrawn breath. Told you so. Nothing. Again, it must be there. Well, it ain't, Your Honour, and if we stays much longer, we'll be on our way to join him. On the end of a rope. Come, let's be off. There was a scuffling and scraping, then the alley and court were momentarily quiet. But Smith did not move yet. Voices and clustering footsteps could be heard coming from the far side of the alley. The pale-faced clerks and scriveners and thin-necked attorneys had caught the scent of spilt blood. They'd come out of their chambers and rooms to congregate solemnly and stare. Invisibly, Smith joined the outskirts of the crowd, muttering away with the best of them. Then he was through like a needle through shoddy to Godliman Street and beyond. As he went, a door opened in the court, and someone came quietly out. A quarter-mile off on the other side of St. Paul's, Smith stopped running. He sat on some steps and fumbled in his ragged ancient coat. What had he got this time? Something valuable, something that had been worth the old gentleman's life. He fished it out. A document. A document! Smith stood up, swore, spat, and cursed. For though he was quicker than a rat, sharper than a stoat, foxier than a fox, though he knew the town's corners and alleys and courts and byways better than he knew his own heart, and though he could vanish into the thick air in the twinkling of an eye, he lacked one necessary quality for the circumstance in hand. He could not read, not so much as a word. Between Saffron Hill and Turnmill Street stood, or rather slouched, the Red Lion Tavern, a very evil-looking, tumble-down structure, weather-boarded on three sides and bounded on the fourth by the Great Fleet Ditch, which stank and gurgled by day and night like the parlour of the tavern itself. This parlour was an ill-lit, noxious place full of thieves, pickpockets, footpads, unlucky swindlers and ruined gamblers, who boozed and snoozed here and were presided over by a greasy landlord who never sold a customer to the gallows for less than a guinea. Here was Smith's home, not in the dignity of the parlour itself, but in the cellar below it, where he lodged with his sisters, Miss Bridget and Miss Fanny. Miss Bridget was stitching a brown velveteen coat, Miss Fanny a pair of grey breeches. "Saw an old gent done in today," said Smith as he appeared. "Indeed," said Miss Fanny. The sisters were engaged in making genteel alterations to cast-off clothing from unfortunates who were hanged. The velveteen coat and the grey breeches were bespoken by the hangman himself, for they'd come off a very high-stepping rogue indeed, and one everybody was sorry to see nabbed. But when Smith brought the garments in, "The law must take its course," had said Miss Bridget, and "'Tis an ill wind," had said Miss Fanny. "Look what I got this time," said Smith. He fished out the document and spread it on the table, full in the light of the tallows. "Just before he was done in. Not a quarter of a minute." The Smith family stared at the document. None of them could read. "What is it?" said Miss Fanny. "'Twas what he was killed for," said Smith, and went on to relate all the circumstances of the crime, not forgetting the unseen man with the limp, the thought of whom terrified him more than anything else. "It's a deed to property," said Miss Bridget. "For that queer thing," she jabbed her needle at a piece of writing,
that looks so like the horse and cart is the word property. Indeed it is. I'd know it anywhere.
Smith was not convinced.
Then why was he done in for it? And why was they so frantic when they couldn't find it? Poor old fool.
Reasons, said Miss Bridget darkly, and returned to the velveteen coat.
I think, said Miss Fanny, that it's a confession. For that piece, like a nest of maggots there, she pricked with her needle, I know to be felonious. Oh, yes, indeed, Smut dear. You got a confession which will be very valuable if we can only find out what's been done. For if they was willing and able to kill for it, they'll be equal willing to pay for it. Clever, Smut.
Smith frowned, still not convinced, but inclined more to a confession than a property deed.
So we must get it read to us, continued Miss Fanny, so we can know where to apply. And who, miss, would you ask? Said Miss Bridget. Lord Tom can read, said Smith, thinking of his highwayman idol and friend. Lord Tom, repeated Fanny, blushing and smiling. Oh, the very scholar.
Miss Bridget sneered.
I'd as soon trust him with anything worth money as I'd trust the landlord.
They went on discussing the likely contents of the document till the tallows burnt low. At length, when the room was full of tallow smoke and shifting shadows, Miss Bridget and Miss Fanny retired to their curtained-off bedroom, and Smith to his corner in the workroom itself, where eventually he fell asleep. When he woke, the document was still on the table. He folded it up and began to tiptoe towards the stairs.
Where are you off to, Smut dear?
Miss Fanny, much tousled and creased, had poked her head through the curtain.
Newgate,
said Smith.
Got business.
A tremendous idea had lodged in Smith's mind and, like all truly great things, answered its purpose so exactly that one exclaimed, why hadn't it been thought of before? He would learn to read. The morning was dull and windy. The cathedral birds were huddled upon Old Bailey, which stood to the leeward side of the stench from Newgate jail. Such merchants and clerks and attorneys who walked the whipping streets kept their heads down and their hands to their wigs and hats. Smith had spread the document inside his coat and across his chest, where it kept him from the worst of the weather.
Be still, old fellow,
he muttered from time to time as the stiff paper pricked and tickled.
You and me's got business. You and me's going up in the world. Just as soon as I gets you to talk.
When he reached the blackened and gloomy felonage of Newgate jail, Smith turned in at the lodge, greeted the jailer there, and lit up his battered pipe against the dreadful smells to come. First, he found out Mr. Jones, the hangman, a short, stout, horny-handed gent who shone with pomatum. He got 3 shillings out of him on account, together with a surly prophecy that if Smith didn't mind his P's and Q's, he'd become Mr. Jones's customer in a transaction with a yardage of hemp.
P's and Q's, said Smith. Them's letters, ain't they?
Mr. Jones agreed.
Then show us a P, Mr. Jones, and then show us a Q, and I'll try to mind them.
For the thought had occurred to Smith that 2 letters would be a fair start to the day's work of learning to read. Unluckily, Mr. Jones took him for a humorist, and aimed a thump that would have been pleasurable if it had struck. From Mr. Jones's it was but a brief, though dark and sullen, way down a ragged stairway, along a passage, a turn to the right, then up 2 steps to the stone hall, where Smith's present hopes were most likely to be passing the time of what was neither night nor day. The stone hall was a long, low, arched room, with its own stone sky and its own 6 lanterns for a sun. When those were lit, it was day. When they were out, it was night, no matter what the outside heavens were declaring. Here was Smith's place of daily business, for he ran errands for the debtors, 2d a mile dry, and 4d when it rained. Very educated gentlemen, the debtors. A man needs to be educated to get into debt. The first Smith tried was a tall, fine-looking gentleman who, though still in leg-irons, walked like he owned the jail. As well he might, for his debts could have bought it entire. He smiled. He was never at a loss for a smile, which was perhaps why he was there. When a man can't pay what he owes, a smile is a deal worse than nothing.
"Learn us to read, mister,"
said Smith. The fine debtor stopped, looked, and sighed. "Not in 10,000 years, my boy. What will you get by it? You'll read warrants and summonses where you might have pleaded ignorance. You'll read of bills overdue and creditors' anger, where you might have ignored it all for another month. Don't learn to read, Smith. Oh, I implore you." The gentleman drifted smiling away with his back straight, his head held high, and his ankles jingling. Next, Smith applied to a learned felon, a ferret-faced man with small, starry eyes.
"What do you want to read for, Smith?" "No need. If it weren't for me skill as a reader, I'd not be here today. I was on the run and saw a new goldsmith's sign, stopped to read it, and here I am. No, stay ignorant, me boy, and keep out of harm's way."
Smith pleaded, but the felon was determined. Surely the town had more scholars than those in Newgate jail. Smith left the prison and drifted through the streets till he came to the booksellers in St. Paul's churchyard. Where better to learn to read than in a bookshop? Several times he idled up and down, judging his chances in each shop. Here a proprietor scowled at him, there a clerk shook his fist. But one shop attracted Smith by the mad profusion and tottery architecture of its wares. Books stood in walls and towers and battlements, as if the owner had been in a state of siege for 100 years, which was partly borne out by his appearance. He was an amazingly thin, wary little man with a nervous affliction which made his head dart from side to side as if wondering from where the attack might come. Nor was he put at ease when he saw Smith, for he'd seen Smith before, even knew him. He sat in a curious kind of cave of books, where he could jerk and twitch in privacy.
"Learn us to read, mister."
"Be off with you," he said, jerking his head to the right.
"Ain't you got no feelings for your trade?" said Smith. "Don't you want it to prosper with more readers?"
"You're a wicked little thief," said the bookseller, now jerking to the left. "Touch a book and I'll finish you." The bookseller was now jerking and twitching pretty vigorously, and, as his head flew from side to side, Smith considerately tried to keep pace with it, which made him appear as if he was performing a wild dance. "Keep still!" shouted the bookseller of a sudden, and jerked worse than ever. Too late. Smith, capering wider and wider, struck first against one and then against the other of the two tottering shelves. The calamity that followed, though of brief duration, was terrific in its scope. It was as if the long siege was at last over and the enemy had breached all the walls at once. The two walls of shelves collapsed, and, with them brought down in a mighty and thunderous torrent, every last item in the whole of the ramshackle shop. Books in their fluttering and dusty thousands poured and thumped down as if the very skies had been loaded with them. Histories, memoirs, diaries, lexicons, grammars, atlases, journals, biographies, poems, plays, books about heaven, books about hell, huge books about pygmies, tiny books about giants, even books about books, all slid and tumbled into a desperate ruin overhung by a bitter cloud of dust. And somewhere underneath it all, still jerking and twitching, though feebly now, lay the unlucky bookseller himself. "God," thought Smith, halfway round the cathedral and going like the wind, "he must be squashed flatter than an old sixpence." But the bookseller was alive and being exhumed by neighbours and passers-by. Strangely enough, he seemed almost the better for the disaster, as though all his life he'd expected and dreaded it, and now that it had happened, a load was fallen from his soul. He jerked and twitched hardly at all as he told how it had come about and who'd been chiefly to blame.
"They call him Smith," he said.
"And where does he come from?"
"Somewhere near the ditch. I fancy it's the Red Lion Tavern."
The questioner had been a passer-by, a man who'd earlier come out of Godliman Street. At about 5 o'clock, Smith went home to the cellar of the Red Lion Tavern, having spent every penny he had on meat pie, ale and tobacco. And though there'd been pockets in plenty for the picking, he'd kept his hands to himself. For the first time he could remember, he was frightened of being caught, for then he'd lose whatever might be the benefits of the document, which was still pressed against his chest, where it was growing strong with sweat.
"Hello, Smith. Not nubbed yet?"
Deep in thought, he ignored the landlord's pleasantry and made for the cellar steps. From below, the tallows gleamed yellowly and cast strange shadows on the wall. He began to descend when...
"Stand and deliver!"
A voice like 12 o'clock of St. Paul's roared from the heart of the cellar. Smith started, missed a step, and came down the rest any way but on his feet. A dangerous, glittering, murdering adventurer of a gentleman in green stood before him, aiming a pistol the scope of a cannon directly at his head. It was his friend, Lord Tom, the High Toby, come on a sociable visit.
"Do watch how you go, Smut," called Miss Fanny, "or you'll be coming down them steps stone dead, and then where will our document be?"
Smith picked himself up and rubbed his head.
"Pleased to see you, Lord Tom. They told me you was nubbed, but I never believed them."
The highwayman put up his pistol.
"It happens to all of us sooner or later, Smut. With some it's sooner, but with Lord Tom, let's hope it'll be vastly the later."
"And so say all of us,"
murmured Miss Fanny, as she might have said, Amen.
"Trade been good these past 10 days, Lord Tom?"
said Smith, giving over 3 shillings to Miss Bridget, who hid them somewhere behind the curtain, away from the highwayman's quick green eyes.
"Been on the Finchley Common, Smut, me young friend, wild and free on the snaffling lay."
"Don't use them coarse expressions," came Miss Bridget's voice. "If you mean pilfering from unarmed travellers, then say so, or are you ashamed?"
Lord Tom grinned at Smith, who grinned back, and then at Miss Fanny, who sighed and blushed.
"Many coaches, Lord Tom? And was there danger?"
"Fine, smart equipages, little Smut. Oh, it's a life, my boy. Stand and deliver! Stern with the gentry, courteous with the ladies. Madam, your necklace, if you please. Sir, your purse, or I'll blow your head off."
"And did you, Lord Tom?"
said Smith, smiling wistfully at the thought of riding out with his friend, which had always been one of his dearest dreams.
"Did you blow any heads off this time?"
"Only a pair of coachmen, Smut, and then unwillingly, for they went for their weapons. But that's enough of me. I hear you've come upon a rare treasure, me lad. A document, I hear tell, and curiously valuable, from all accounts."
"I told Lord Tom,"
said Miss Fanny, stopping her sewing with her needle at full stretch,
"and we're of an opinion that—"
"'Tis nothing of value," said Miss Bridget, coming through the curtain.
"A property deed, most likely, of no use to anyone at all." "And I say, it's a confession, Brid. Really, Lord Tom, dear, I'm convinced. Indeed, the more I think of it, it had such a guilty look."
Lord Tom looked round cheerfully.
"Well then, let's put an end to conjecture and see it. Here, Smut, old comrade in arms. Let's see the document. Lord Tom will read it for you.
Smith, suddenly uneasy, stared at his two sisters. Then he looked up at his friend, the glittering, dangerous highwayman. He hesitated and began to back towards the stairs. Now that his secret was about to be revealed, he felt unsure, even unwilling. For a whole day the document had been next to his heart. He felt strangely that he'd be betraying it if he gave it up now.
Well, Smut friend, where's the treasure?
I ain't got it, Lord Tom. I left it with a friend.
Not that creeping Mr. Palmer,
exclaimed Miss Bridget.
How I hate debtors, they're worse than thieves.
Smith shook his head and rubbed his nose ruefully.
Well, then who's got it, Smut dear? Said Miss Bridget. Who's got our valuable document? The parson in St. Andrews.
And where did you meet him?
In church.
Now I know you're lying, for you was never in a church in all your born days. Liar and blasphemer! Oh, how I hate a liar! Nothing's more degrading. You come here, you young person, and I'll wash your mouth out with vinegar for you.
Miss Bridget, who had indeed a jar of vinegar in her hand, began to advance on Smith with her eyes glinting venomously. Smith began to dart round the cellar at so great a rate that the tallow flames tore after him as if to rip loose from their seatings.
I'll teach you to lie to me,
called Miss Bridget, making strong dives at her brother, who, between howling and roaring his innocence, kept dragging table and stools and every movable article into her path. On the stair, cutting off all retreat, sat Miss Fanny and Lord Tom, laughing fit to burst. Suddenly there was a fateful interruption. The landlord. His greasy head hung over the stair like a dirty street lamp.
Smith! Smith! Forgot to tell you something.
What?
You had callers. 2.
Who? Me?
Yes, indeed, had you off to a tea. Dirty, weaselish, villainous-looking remnant. Eyes like chips of coal, teeth like the same, about 12-year-old. That's him, I says directly. Good, says they. And where is he? Nubbed, most likely, says I. Oh, ho, says they. We'll be back then to inspect the remains. Then they was off. No message, just that.
What was they like?
One tall, t'other short, wearing brown. And though I says it myself, and I ought to know, as unsavoury and throat-slittish a pair as ever I've clapped eyes on.
The landlord's head was hoisted out of view, and there was a deep silence in the cellar. Smith shivered uncontrollably. He was desperately frightened. God knew how the 2 men in brown had tracked him down, but they had. He couldn't stop his teeth chattering. Even Miss Bridget looked at him compassionately.
It's them, he said. They've come to slit me throat.
Don't you worry, my lad,
said Lord Tom.
There's no high Toby, thief, or rascal who dare come here when he knows Lord Tom's on your side. By God, Smut, if they so much as sets foot on them stairs, I'll blow blue daylight through the both of them. You've a man to protect you now, and I can't say fairer than that.
No, said Smith, you don't know 'em. They'll do for me. They're that sort. I can't stay here. Not now. Not at night.
Smith looked round the cellar, which was his home, very mournful and wretched.
I've got to go. For God's sake, let me past.
Lord Tom shrugged his shoulders, but stood aside.
I'd protect you, Smut. Honest, I would.
The document, Smut. Won't you leave it, dear? It'll bring you no good. Out of my way!
Shouted Smith, and with a desperate rush flew up the stairs and was gone. 2 men, one short, and the other tall, who might have been dressed in brown, the street was too dark to be sure, saw Smith hurry out of the Red Lion Tavern. They'd been in a doorway nearby, deep in shadows. They did not think they'd been observed. After a few seconds, they set off together in the wake of the hurrying boy. They followed him for about 5 minutes along the nearly empty Saffron Hill. Then they lost him. He seemed to have vanished into the gloomy air. Half a minute later he was seen, unexpectedly, on their left, at the corner of Cross Street, hurrying like a mad thing. They nodded and set off again. This time they did not let him out of their sight for more than an instant. Portpool Lane, Hatton Garden, Chart Street, back into Saffron Hill, then Holborn Hill, Union Court, Hatton Garden again, and so to Cross Street, Saffron Hill, Cox's Court. An intricate necklace of flight was being threaded as the three hurrying figures shifted through and round the lanes, courts, and alleys that lay, ragged and near deserted, under a gnawed rind of the moon. The boy had left the Red Lion Tavern at 6:30 by St. Paul's. At 9:15 o'clock, the followers leaned up against a wall in Hatton Garden.
"For God's sake," said one, "I can't go another step. Me heart'll burst, I swear it,"
came a low reply.
"All right. We'll go back, somehow, to the Red Lion. We'll wait there. God rot the crafty little perisher."
With painful steps they limped away, so wind-broken by 2¼ hours of unceasing pursuit that they seemed scarce able to drag their own meagre shadows down the cold street. 10 minutes later, in a narrow abutment no more than a yard from where they'd been leaning, a shadow moved. Then a face edged out, a small, pointed, wary face. It surveyed the empty street. It grinned, not with pleasure, but with a savage and desperate triumph. Smith had done what he'd set out to do when he'd seen the men waiting for him as he'd left the Red Lion. He'd run his pursuers into the ground. He began to walk, somewhat slowly, for his own sides were aching villainously. Presently he stopped and drew the sweat-drenched document from under his coat. He studied it by the thin, cold light of the moon. It did not seem much the worse for its wetting. Miss Bridget's property and Miss Fanny's felonious looked as much like a horse and cart and a nest of maggots as ever. None the less, at the first opportunity, he picked a passing pocket of a handkerchief and wrapped the document up. Then he sighed with relief and set off for another part of the town. Though no one followed him now, he moved with extraordinary circumspection, for the dark houses and the dimly silvered streets held another more formidable menace. Time and again he fancied he heard other footsteps, steps that limped awkwardly, and he thought of the unseen lame man with the soft voice. Now he was in High Holborn, and his nose, chin, and fingers were beginning to burn with the cold. Not a night to be out in, black and windy, with the moon now doused in a creeping sea of cloud. He passed by a gloomy alehouse with a bunch of iron grapes groaning from its sign. He stopped, fingered a guinea he'd got with the handkerchief, and thought of a bed for the night. But the house was full, so he took a half a pint of gin to keep out the cold, the loneliness, and the shifting fear, to no purpose. The gin sickened him and inflamed his brain, so's he heard everywhere the soft voice he dreaded and the awkward scrape of a leg, quaintly lame. Out again into the bitter street. Above his head the iron grapes creaked menacingly back and forth. He began to run wildly, now from side to side of the street, banging into posts, stumbling across the gutter, turning down lanes and alleys that were new even to him. Where was he going? God knew. Maybe even in search of the two men in brown to give up the document. For suddenly it seemed to him that the document was a fearful disease that was burning and poisoning him. At last he found himself in a long, wide street where the moon had widowed all the houses with black hatchments under their porches. Vaguely he thought he knew where he was. There was a narrow turning any minute now, an alleyway that would lead him, deviously, back to the Red Lion. He fancied he saw it. He turned. "Watch out! Watch out! Oh!" At the very moment Smith had turned into the alley, a gentleman had come out of it. They met, and though the gentleman was tall and stout and huge beside Smith, he was struck with such speed and force that he fell with an angry, frightened cry. Smith struggled to his feet, was about to rush on, when a hand grasped at his ankle.
Let go, he called.
Damn you, no! Help me first!
Smith glared wildly down. He saw the gentleman's face, grey as a puddle. His eyes were sunken and dark. No spark of light in them.
Help me up! Help me, I say! For pity's sake, sir! Can't you see I'm blind?
A blind man, said Smith. If you let go my ankle, I'll help you up. That's if you're really blind. Can you see me?
The gentleman shook his head, loosed his hold on Smith's ankle, and heaved himself up on one elbow. He'd lost his hat, and his wig was awry, but otherwise he'd suffered no harm. He began to feel the adjacent cobbles for his possessions. Smith fished inside his coat and pulled out the document.
What have I got in me hand?
He said. The blind man sighed.
My life, my boy. My life's in your hand.
Smith scowled and put away the document.
Here you are, Mr. Mole in the Hole. Here's me hand, then. Up with you! Up on your pins! And here's your hat and stick and black spectacles. Now why you wears 'em foxes me. My, but you're a real giant of a gent. Did you know it?
This last as the blind man stood up and fairly towered over the helpful Smith.
Thank you, boy. Now, tell me if I'm in the street or the alley, and I'll give you a guinea for your pains.
You're on the corner.
Or facing which way?
Well, the Lord knows, I've been sick myself.
Fever?
Half a pint of gin.
Suddenly, Smith felt a strong desire to confide in the blind man. After all, it could do no harm.
Smith,
he said, and held out one hand, while with the other he guided the blind man's hand to meet it.
12 years old, dark-haired, and lately residing in the Red Lion Tavern off Saffron Hill.
The blind man smiled, and his questing hand grasped Smith's firmly.
Mansfield, he said. Blind as a wall for these past 12 years. Well-to-do, but not much enjoying it. Mansfield. Residing at number 7 Vine Street under the care of a daughter. Mansfield. Believe it or not, a magistrate.
God, who'd have thought I'd ever be shaking hands with a bleeding justice?
If Mr. Mansfield heard, he was too gentlemanly to remark on it. Instead, he fumbled in his coat for the promised guinea.
And now, just point me toward the church that should stand at one end of the street, and the guinea's yours, Smith, with my deepest thanks.
Smith obliged, and took the guinea.
Seems a lot for a little, he said.
Good night, Smith.
Same to you, Mr. Mansfield, J.P.
He watched the blind man tap his way down the street, bumping here and there into the posts, and was about to make off when a strangely familiar feeling of pity stirred in him. He had been reminded of the murdered old gentleman. He scowled at his own indecision, stuck his ancient pipe defiantly in his mouth, and hastened in the blind man's wake.
That you, Smith?
Smith grunted.
Here's me hand, then. You old blind justice, you. Just tell me where to turn and where to cross, and I'll see you home safe and sound. After all, I ain't done much for that guinea.
Mr. Mansfield found the offered hand, and once more grasped it. He sighed, and reflected in his heart, which was far from being as blind as his eyes, that it was an uncanny thing to be the cause of kindness in others. Vine Street lay about 20 minutes away. Mr. Mansfield had strolled far that night, having a troublesome problem that gnawed him. But now, holding Smith's thin hand, the problem sank somewhat. After a while, Smith said,
Were it a sickness?
My blindness, do you mean? No. Lost my sight when a house burned down. Lost my wife as well. A costly fire, that.
What's it like, being blind?
Dark, Smith. Very dark. What's it like having eyes?
Oh, the moon's gone in again. So we're two of a kind, Mr. Mansfield. You and me.
The blind magistrate felt somewhat taken down, but was cautious not to show it. 12 years of his misfortune had taught him that a bland face was the best security for one in his situation, and that for a blind man to frown, scowl, or laugh even, was like a fool discharging his pistol wildly in the night. The Lord knew who'd be hit by it.
If you can see a new-built church with a round tower, cross in front of it and walk with it to your right,
Smith obliged. Hand in hand they passed by the church, a very curious pair indeed. Small Smith half a pace ahead, and huge, stout Mr. Mansfield walking somewhat sideways and behind, for Smith tended to pull rather.
Vine Street is the next street that crosses this one. My house is to the right. I'll be safe enough now, Smith.
No trouble. I'm going the same way. To the door, Mr. Mansfield.
They came to Vine Street. Mr. Mansfield said,
If you've naught better to do, will you come in and take a bite of late supper with me, Smith?
I don't mind if I do, Mr. Mansfield.
Care to stay the night, Smith?
Don't mind if I do, Mr. Mansfield.
Any family, Smith?
Sisters. 2 of them.
Likely to worry?
Not much.
Then it's settled.
Just as you say, Mr. Mansfield.
Anything else I can do for you, Smith?
Smith sighed ruefully. The only thing he really wanted, Mr. Mansfield was unable to provide.
No, thank you, Mr. Mansfield. You've done all you can.
They came towards the door of number 7. In spite of himself, Smith grinned at the irony of his situation. Of all the men in the town to bump into and befriend, he'd lit on the one who was blind, and so could never teach him to read. Miss Mansfield stood on the topmost step, full in the light of the porch lamp. Below her waited a footman ready to help his master. Though she was amiable, charitable, and kind to a degree, no one with a pair of eyes in his head would have mistaken Miss Mansfield for a saint. She was made of a commoner humanity than that, and took full advantage of her father's blindness to scowl and grimace, and sometimes shake her small, fierce fist when the blind man's disability caused her irritation or annoyance, which it often did. But her voice was always gentle and kind.
Papa, I was so worried. You've been gone so long, sir. I thought he was...
Here she paused as Smith came into the light, and she saw, what the blind man could not, that Smith was the filthiest, wretchedest, and nearly the most sinister-looking object in the town. Lost, she finished up, and her face expressed wonderfully her opinion of Smith. Smith tugged at Mr. Mansfield's hand, for he feared Miss Mansfield would set the footman on to do him a mischief.
Daughter, said the blind man, here's Smith, as good-hearted a child as the town can boast of.
Miss Mansfield did not look as though she believed it. Her face said very clearly, So, you've deceived him. Very well, then, you won't deceive me. I've a pair of eyes in my head. But aloud she said, Pleased to make your acquaintance, Smith. Any friend of my father's is more than welcome.
Daughter,
said Mr. Mansfield, mounting the steps and pulling Smith after him,
my young friend's taking supper with us, and then he'll stay the night, for it's very bitter in the air, and he is far from home.
At this, Miss Mansfield looked so little pleased that Smith was amazed that even the blind man couldn't see it.
Any friend of ours, sir,
she repeated, and bustled back into the house to attend to her father's wish. They took supper in the back parlour, as clean, spacious, and handsome a room as Smith had ever dreamed of, furnished with mahogany, and with much neat silver on display. There were pictures on the walls and a fire in the grate, and it was a shame the blind man could see none of it, for a deal of trouble seemed to have been taken. While they ate, Miss Mansfield came and went, some dozen times, with amiable inquiries or amusing observations, but always with a look of the sharpest suspicion at Smith, followed by a glance round the room to see what had been stolen. "I know what you're up to," her angry face said, "but you'll not succeed, not while I've a pair of eyes in my head."
"A saint!"
said Mr. Mansfield once, when he was assured his daughter was gone from the room. Just then the saint came in to say Smith's bed was ready in a small room at the top of the house, and to shoot him as venomous and disgusted a look as he'd ever received in his life. He shivered, for he found his haven for the night uncanny, what with the blind justice and the daughter at odds with herself. Nonetheless, he was, at bottom, an affable soul, and continued to talk with Mr. Mansfield a while longer. He talked about life in the streets of the town, life in the Red Lion's cellar, life in Newgate jail, death at Tyburn, and death in Curtis Court. Yes, indeed, Smith mentioned, almost in passing, the happening that had turned him upside down and inside out.
"Indeed, I heard of it," said the magistrate. "Mr. Field of Prickler's Hill in Hertfordshire.
I knew him, Smith. A good, wealthy, but sad old gentleman.
I'd like to have his murderer before me."
"And so would I, Mr. Mansfield,"
said Smith, his mind filled with the news that Mr. Field had been wealthy. Hopes of the document were now very high. Soon after this, Miss Mansfield came into the room and declared that it was growing too late to be talking. "Not so much for you, Papa, but for your young friend. Truly he looks tired, sir. His bed is ready, and he ought to be in it." Which remark, delivered most affably, was accompanied by a casting of eyes to the ceiling, which said very plain, "And the sheets he sleeps in will have to be burned. Oh, Papa, this is outrageous." Smith's room was small and oddly shaped, owing to its situation under the roof. Now Smith, though he'd slept on straw all his life, wasn't so ignorant as not to know a bed when he saw one. He prodded it, he sat on it, he lay on it, he lay in it, he grinned, and directly went to sleep. He slept without dreaming, without moving. He slept so long and so deep that Miss Mansfield, poking her head round the door in the morning, thought for the instant that he'd perished in the night and left behind him a small black corpse. "Smith!" she called. "Boy! Wake up! Directly!" And she poked at him with a walking stick she seemed to have brought especially for the purpose. Smith woke up, saw Miss Mansfield's ferocious concern, and rolled deftly away. But he forgot he was sleeping 2 feet off the floor. He fell and swore. "Language!" shrieked Miss Mansfield, and poked at Smith furiously with the stick. Over breakfast, which was taken in the back parlour, Mr. Mansfield said, "And will you go back to your cellar, Smith?" Smith shrugged his thin shoulders. Miss Mansfield looked at him, and then to her father in weary aggravation. Did the blind man live but to spite her? What was he thinking of? So why didn't he come out with it then? Must everything be left to her? "Smith," she said, her face far from reflecting her words, "Mr. Mansfield means, will you stay here? And work for your board and keep, of course. Mr. Mansfield is very concerned about you. He thinks you deserve better of the world than you've got, and would give it to you. My father is quite a saint, you know."
"Oh, come, daughter, 'tis your own idea."
"Never, never in 10,000 years. I read it all in your face, sir." Smith, his mouth full, looked from one to the other of the Mansfields, each accusing the other of a kindness. "Then it's settled," said Miss Mansfield. "Mr. Mansfield will employ you in the stables, Smith, and I here she looked, God help me, will attend to your improvement. For a beginning, Smith, I shall teach you to read. Smith stared. He gaped. He poked his finger in his ear and scraped it about. What was it she'd said? Teach him to read? To read? He beamed. And beamed. He couldn't stop himself. He wondered if his face would ever go back again. I think he's pleased, Papa, murmured Miss Mansfield. I suppose he's fond of horses. Mr. Mansfield offered to send a servant to the Red Lion to acquaint Miss Fanny and Miss Bridget with their brother's situation. But Smith said he'd rather go himself. I'll tell him tomorrow, he said, and left it at that. Now all was settled indeed, and Smith, on Miss Mansfield's orders, returned to his mad-shaped room. In high good humour he fell upon the bed and took out the precious document, the last remains of Mr. Field of Prickler's Hill in Hertfordshire. Excitedly he waved it aloft like a banner. Won't be long now, old fellow. Very soon you and me will be better acquainted, and then up we'll go in the world. He folded it and wrapped it once more in the pilfered handkerchief. And not a moment too soon. Footsteps. Quickly he pushed it into the tumbled bed linen. The door opened. 2 footmen with real hangman's faces. Alarm seized Smith. Why had they come? And why so grim? Up with you, said one. And then down with you, said the other. What do you mean? They grinned. Mrs. Instructions. She says, afore you commence on scrubbing the yard, that self-same necessary thing must be done to you. So down to the scullery, young Smith. Smith's eyes glittered in alarm. Most likely he paled too, but that wasn't so easy to see. He looked about him, but there was no escape. He looked up to the footman. No mercy, not even pity there. To the scullery, young Smith. Now, Smith had never been washed since, most likely, the midwife had obliged 12 darkening years ago. Consequently, he suspected the task would be long, hard, and painful. He was not mistaken. 2 more footmen, aproned over their livery, stood ready and waiting by a steaming iron tub. Take off them wretched rags, Smith. He began to undress. Disdainfully the footman watched him, and indignantly he stared back. Ain't you never seen a person take off his clothes before? At last he crouched, naked as a charred twig, quivering and twitching as if the air was full of tickling feathers. The 4 footmen set to work. 2 held him in the tub, 1 scrubbed, and 1 acted as ladleman. This last task was on account of the water having been dosed with sulphur, and it consisted in spooling off Smith's livestock as it rushed to the surface in a speckled throng. From beginning to end, the washing of Smith took close upon 3 hours, with the scullery so filled with sulphurous steam that the footmen's misted faces grew red as the copper saucepans that hung like midnight suns on the scullery's streaming walls. At last it was done. He was taken out, rinsed, and wrapped in a sheet, the ghost of his former self. For he was now a stark, white replica of the previous Smith, and, had his sisters seen him, they'd have shrieked and sworn it was his spectral image. His clothes were burned before his oddly saddened eyes. "Me clothes," he said. "Me belongings. I can't go about like this." Then he was told a livery was being cut down for him, and he was to go back to his room and wait. He mounted the stairs, much hampered by the sheet he was wrapped in. But there was great determination in him. Each fresh disaster he endured seemed to strengthen his bond with the document, and whatever it might contain. In a way, it seemed to be payment in advance. He opened the door to his room. He stared. His eyes filled with tears of horror and dismay. The bed was stripped. The bedding was gone. And with it, the document. When they brought him his fine new livery, blue with brass buttons, they wondered why he was sat, crouched on his bare bed, with his knees drawn up like battlements before his face, and they remarked, when they left him, on the look in his eyes as he watched them come and go, dismay and despair. They laughed on the way downstairs, but not unkindly, and decided his system was still shocked from his washing. Oh, give him another half-hour and he'll be trying on his new clothes and strutting like the king of the weasels. But after half an hour there was no change, save that maybe Smith's head was sunk a little lower and his eyes stared with a deeper despair. Miss Mansfield came to see him. She scowled angrily at his sick, despairing air. "Are you ill, Smith? What's wrong with you? Answer me." "Nothing, miss. Nothing." She went away much troubled and ordered blankets to be taken up and Smith to be wrapped inside them. Several times during the afternoon she returned, hoping against hope to find him restored, but each time he seemed more sunk within himself. "Oh, it's as if," said the housekeeper, "that poor mite has made up his mind to die." And so it began to seem to all the Vine Street household, save Mr. Mansfield himself, from whom it was desperately kept. To her father's repeated inquiries, Miss Mansfield answered, "He's quite worn out from the footman's labour, sir. I fancy he'll sleep the clock round. Best not disturb him yet." During the evening, Mr. Billing called. Mr. Billing was a youngish attorney, and was both Mr. Mansfield's friend, and also deeply in love with his daughter. But on this evening Miss Mansfield found the attorney tiresome and overstaying his welcome. She longed to creep up to the top of the house and see the strange, sad child. She had a terrible feeling he'd die in the night. Mr. Billing stayed and stayed, affable and talkative as ever, and all the while she longed to cry out, "Begone, begone! There's a dying boy upstairs, and I must go to him." Instead, she helped him to port and brandy, as her father directed, and never left the room for an instant, being afraid of arousing her father's suspicions that all was not well with Smith. She chattered as amiably as she was able, and hoped her suitor would read the anxious impatience in her eyes. But, unluckily, Mr. Billing was used to Miss Mansfield's varied and odd expressions, and, though he loved each and all of them, he took no particular note of any. Below stairs, all but two of the servants had gone to bed, a dozing footman and a certain scullery maid called Meg, a soft-hearted person, with large arms the colour of boiled lobsters. All the evening her muddled, motherly mind had been fixed on the sick child at the top of the house, and a certain notion had come to her. Knowing that the boy had been brought up in an ale-cellar, she supposed he was homesick for all familiar things. She brooded on this till there was no one about to question her. Then she crept up to Smith with a pint of ale. Not that she supposed he'd drink it, but she firmly believed that the sight and smell of it would do his aching heart a power of good. Smith stared up at her mournfully. Her heart was fairly wrung. She moved about the tiny room to spread the ale's odours. Smith watched her. She smiled and held out the tankard. "Come along, little one. It'll do you a power of good. Drink it up, for not the Red Lion itself has a better ale." Smith gazed at her sombrely. "Nothing but kindness is meant. All's for your own good. They'll feed and clothe you and treat you like a human being. You'll want for naught here." Smith looked as though all he ever wanted was to pass unhindered away. Meg's eyes grew great with tears. "They had to wash you. You was that black. You should have seen the sheets." "Sheets? Did you see 'em?" For the first time Smith showed signs of interest in the world. His nose twitched and his eyes began to kindle. "The ale," thought Meg triumphantly. "It's the smell of the ale what's doing it. Why, bless you, yes. And they was that horrible Miss wanted them burned. And did you? Lord, no, burn good sheets. I boiled them." At this Smith stared at her so strangely that she began to fidget. "Well, was anything else with the sheets?" Obligingly, Meg shut her eyes to recall the scene. "Well, there was a handkerchief, but 'twas so far gone I burnt it." "Burnt it? Oh!" Here Smith gave such a shriek and a groan that Meg thought his last moment was come. "I had too little one. 'Twas in a shameful state. It smelled, dear, like... Oh, I don't know what it smelled like, for I've naught to compare it with. Powerful, clinging. I only hope it'll wear off the master's paper. Paper, said Smith, not daring to hope, and yet not able to prevent it. What paper? His eyes glittered so brilliantly, and he began to shiver so violently that Meg edged away, fearing a contagious mortal fever. Why, one of the master's documents that had somehow got itself muddled in that dreadful handkerchief. A lawyer's document of sorts. How did you know it was a lawyer's document? Smith was coming back to life with a vengeance. Meg, seeing the boy's improvement, smiled confidentially. "'Twas marked for the attorneys Billing and Leonard, with whom we have dealings. Billing and cooing, I call 'em, on account of Mr. Billing being so sweet on Miss Mansfield. He's in the parlour now. Oh, such a handsome pair." Her smile grew soft and misty. "Did you give it to him?" "To our Mr. Billing? Lord, no. That's for the master to do. Besides, it was for the other one, for Mr. Leonard." "So you gave it to Mr. Mansfield?" "Questions, questions. Was you a cat, you'd be stone dead. No, I never gave it to him. There. Why, it smelled so bad it would have knocked him flat. I put it in his study along with his other papers. Only I put it at the bottom so's the smell might wear off before he comes to it. That's what makes a good servant. Consideration for her master's feelings. Oh, there's a good lad. Drunk up your ale. Just homesick, weren't you? Knew it all the time. Trust Meg." It was now midnight, and, to Miss Mansfield's aggravation and distress, Mr. Billing stayed for another hour. Then at last he went, and, when her father was safely in bed, she flew upstairs with an anguished heart, expecting she knew not what. She opened the door. She looked inside, and she all but dropped her candle. The room was empty. The boy was gone. Her face grew pale with dread. A terrible fear assailed her. The boy, feeling himself to be dying, had struggled from his bed and crept from the house. In blackest despair she began to go downstairs. Suddenly she stopped. She'd heard a noise. Very gentle, very subtle, very secretive. A papery rustle from her father's study. She opened the door. She held up the candle. "Smith! Oh, my God! I'm done for!" The floor about Mr. Mansfield's desk looked as though it had been snowed on by documents. Depositions, confessions, summonses, and judgments lay in a guilty profusion, and in the midst of them crouched Smith, wearing only his shirt and looking like an outsized document himself, with his face turned up like a grey seal of terror. All Miss Mansfield's dread and anguish turned now into a violent fury and bitterness. "Smith, is this how you repay Mr. Mansfield? By robbing him? Stealing from a blind man? Is this the kindness of heart that so moved him? Nothing but the cunning skill of a cruel rogue." Smith, still among the documents, stared up at her with a mixture of misery and fear. He'd not yet found his precious document, which he knew he'd have recognised even among the hundreds he'd strewn about. Now he was done for. Miss Mansfield scowled, and her face in the candlelight looked like a small thundercloud. What could one expect of such a child? All his life a thief. She began to grow angry with her father. He ought to have expected something like this, but he was so foolishly sentimental, just because the boy showed him a kindness when any other wretch would have robbed him and left him for dead. Why should he think Smith was exceptional? Her father was outrageous. Always he expected her to have the patience of a saint. Well, she hadn't. She was peevish, and now he'd left her to deal with the wretched boy while he slept on in happy ignorance. At length, scowling worse than ever under the strain of her long inner quarrel, she said, "Smith, I'm disappointed, it's true. But you're fortunate that Mr. Mansfield is more understanding than his daughter. She, I promise you, would have had you clapped straight into Newgate. But Mr. Mansfield never expected an angel out of you all at once. No, Mr. Mansfield's a saint, Smith, and on that account you may thank your stars. Go back to bed this instant, and we'll say no more of tonight. But if I catch you doing any such thing again, then it's Newgate for you, my lad, on the instant. Now, To bed. Don't gape. Don't cry. Tears won't move me. Or don't you understand, Smith? You've been given another chance." Little by little in the next 3 weeks, Smith came to think as well of the Mansfields as anyone else in the world, Lord Tom and his sisters excepted. Though both of them on occasion frightened him half to death, there were times when they did no such thing. There were times even when they made him grin, for example when they quarrelled over which of them was to be blamed for a kindness. There were times when nothing pleased Smith more than Miss Mansfield's praise of his progress in reading, so that, for the moment, her good opinion seemed the chief purpose in his studying, and not the document at all. He mastered the alphabet, that sinister collection of twists and curls and crosses and gibbet-shaped signs that resembled nothing so much as the irons that hung on Newgate's most dreadful walls, and soon he could pronounce aloud such words as Miss Mansfield wrote on his slate. "My name is Smith," he spluttered out with great difficulty, only understanding the sentiment as he heard the sounds he made. "Well done," said Miss Mansfield, and Smith, though pleased to have pleased her, was mildly aggrieved to discover that so much effort had gone into saying aloud what was perfectly well known to both of them all the time. Nonetheless, he was much encouraged, and Miss Mansfield promised him that in but a short while more he'd be able to read whatever his heart desired, on which Smith's eyes would stray towards Mr. Mansfield's study with an expression of great yearning and hope. Sometimes Mr. Mansfield himself would stay to listen to Smith's lesson, now and then explaining something of which his poor blind eyes still held the memory. But mostly he kept silent, save when he too had occasion to praise the boy's quickness and progress. And this, when it happened, moved Smith oddly, for he sensed a deep generosity behind it. And if anything could bring tears to Smith's eyes, apart from a thump on the nose, it was the sudden warmth of a generous heart. Nor were the Mansfields the only ones who were pleased by Smith's redemption from black ignorance, which was following so pat on his redemption from his other blackness. Mr. Billing had come to hear of Miss Mansfield's pupil, and the lad's arrival and subsequent improvement at Miss Mansfield's hands formed a fresh subject for his lively chatter. This Mr. Billing was a handsome fellow of 30 or thereabouts. He had rosy cheeks, a prosperous dark moustache, and eyes that, when they weren't shining with devotion to Miss Mansfield, were shining with all of an attorney's shrewdness and wit. He walked with quick, springy steps, and put off his cloak with an air. These facts Smith had learned from observing him from the dark top of the stairs, for Miss Mansfield preferred to break off the lesson rather than have her suitor and the stable-boy, whose tongue she couldn't answer for, meet face to face. Smith was now very close to being able to read. His long battle was nearly won. Letters were making words for him, words were making sentences. Great pages of print that scarce 4 weeks ago had seemed no more than a mad patterning of the paper, now spoke haltingly to him, even told stories, as if long dead gentlemen woke up under his struggling eyes, buttonholed his mind and breathed their thoughts and dreams into it. But still there were gaps and lapses and conjunctions of letters that seemed to have no business together. He thought often of the document, but he knew it was useless to him till he could fill those gaps and lapses. So he waited for the day when Miss Mansfield should declare, "Smith, now you can read whatever your heart desires." But with the over-attentive attorney's interruptions, that day did not come till a certain Tuesday morning, when the event Miss Mansfield had tried so hard to prevent also came to pass, as sooner or later it had to. "Well, Smith," she said with a proud and affectionate smile, "now all the wisdom of the world is yours for the taking. For you can read, my dear." On which Smith's heart leapt almost to the skies. And when there came at almost the self-same moment the familiar double knock at the front door, he felt, in place of his customary resentment, a grand relief that he could escape and caper and dance in private triumph. "It's Mr. Billing, miss," he said. "Come a-cooing. So I'll be off and hide myself now. The best of luck to you, miss. I'm sure you'll be very happy." With that he fled from the library in high delight, and with the best will in the world stopped in the hall to wish Mr. Billing the same. "Best of happiness in your cooing, Mr. Billing," he called. then faltered on his way down the stairs. The rosy-cheeked attorney had gone a deathly white. A look of wild amazement had come upon his face. His eyes had widened. His mouth had dropped open. A shudder had gone through him. Then, as abruptly as his colour had gone, so did he, without so much as a word for the lady of his heart. The door slammed violently, and Smith, sensing he was the cause, went hastily to the kitchen, puzzled and vaguely alarmed. About half an hour after he'd left, Mr. Billing returned, and in a state of such high excitement, said the footman who'd admitted him, that he felt sure the gentleman had at last plucked up his courage to ask for the mistress's hand. He'd been shown into the library, where the mistress and master were wondering on his unaccountable departure. The footman had listened for long enough to hear Mr. Billing declare that Miss Mansfield was looking handsomer than ever he could remember.
"So she is," said Meg, "for love paints our faces something beautiful."
Here the housekeeper, a single lady with a complexion midway between a lemon and a turnip, said,
"Stuff and nonsense,"
but looked very wistful. And Smith, whose uneasiness had taken a sharp turn for the worse on the attorney's return, said,
"Oh, thank God."
The housekeeper looked at him curiously, and Smith, feeling the vague danger past, said,
"It was only that I thought he'd been took ill before."
And he went on to relate the brief meeting which he'd previously kept to himself. Meg was of the opinion that Mr. Billing's sudden pallor and departure were due to nothing other than a brief loss of courage in his heart's intentions, which he'd forthwith gone out to strengthen at the nearest tavern.
"I'll wager he'd a smell of brandy about him," she said.
The footman who'd answered the door agreed that there had been a brandyish air about the attorney, and a parlour-maid who'd been listening at the library door came down with the news that the attorney seemed tongue-tied, a sure sign for someone in his calling of being in the last extreme of love. Meg, in a mood of powerful tenderness, laid her large arm about Smith's shoulders.
"And this little mite's the one who brought it all on. Oh, the mistress has grown that tender since he's been with us. He's warmed her heart and opened it up to Mr. Billing's cooing. It would never have come about without our little Smith. So give honour and kindness with the same adieu."
With that, she imprinted a large, moist kiss on Smith's surprised face. He blushed, and everyone laughed. So when the parlour-maid, who'd gone back to her post at the library door, came down with the news that Smith was wanted, everyone, even Smith himself, was convinced it was because Miss Mansfield wanted to show off the wonders she'd worked in him. Smith went proudly up the stairs. The Vine Street household followed closely after, to give him a last pat on the back as he knocked on the library door and went inside. It was just on midday. For a second time the attorney shuddered. To the depths of his soul, it seemed. "It is him. This is the boy I saw. In the court. This boy stabbed Field. I saw him. He is the murderer. My poor friends, how monstrously you've been deceived." Mr. Billing was the man from Godliman Street, the same man who'd questioned the unlucky bookseller. Miss Mansfield, elegant, handsome and gay in a yellow brocaded dress, had lost every scrap of her complexion. She'd put her hand to her face as if to hide from the world her horror and dismay.
"No. No, it's not so. You're mistook, sir. Not this boy. Never, I tell you."
But in her heart of hearts she could not but believe the attorney, not because she wanted to, but because she dreaded it was so. "It's the boy I saw from my window in Curtis Court. I saw him struggle, I saw him stab, I saw him escape. There is no doubt. I wish to God there was." Miss Mansfield crossed the room to her father, that motionless man in his high-backed chair. She made to lay her hand on his, which was fixed upon his stick, but he sensed her intention and waved her off. The customary blandness of his face seemed carved out of granite. Smith could do nothing but say several times over, "I never laid a finger on the old man. I never touched the old man. I never—" He crept to Mr. Billing, stared up at him very piteously. You was wrong, Mr. Billing. For God's sake, tell 'em. For you're a-killing me." But the attorney shook his handsome head. "Not wrong, Smith. I saw. I know."
"Then damn you!"
shouted Smith, and flew to the Mansfields, blind father and tragic daughter.
Miss, you knows me. I never done it. You believe me, Miss Mansfield? Please?
In an inward agony, Miss Mansfield stared down at Smith, and then to the sad but certain attorney, who seemed to have no reason in the world to lie. "Oh, Smith," she said, and turned away.
Then damn you too!
Smith bent down, crouching at the magistrate's feet, his old blind justice, his mole in the hole.
Mr. Mansfield, believe me, you know me, and I know you. You know I never done him in.
But the magistrate, to whom justice was the only fixed thing in a dark, uncertain world, said nothing. He was casting out of his heart and mind everything save the attorney's measured words and the urchin's frantic denials, word against word.
Mr. Mansfield!
Smith stared up and saw his own face distortedly reflected in the blind man's black spectacles.
You must believe it wasn't me. It was them 2 men in brown and...
2 men in brown?
Yes, and...
Yet you told me once you'd never seen Mr. Field.
Too late. Smith realized he'd ruined himself. Now he was done for. The blind man sighed like the winter wind.
So it was you who killed him? You will be committed to prison to await your trial.
The warrant was sworn and witnessed. "I'll go with him to the jail," said the attorney. "It's the least I can do. Let the wretched child have some company on his journey. I'll see him decently lodged." The coach was waiting. "To Newgate," said the attorney, and joined his victim. For a little way, the 2 occupants stared at each other. Then, when the wheels had settled down to a steady, loud rattle, Mr. Billing leaned forward. The skin round his eyes puckered somewhat, as if to suggest a smile, but his eyes were still like stone. "Give it to me, boy." Dully, Smith began to comprehend. "For God's sake, boy, there's not much time. Give it to me. The paper you stole from the old man, let me have it, and you can go."
I ain't got it.
"Then, where is it?"
Don't know."
Mr. Billing shook his head. "Keep silent now, if you must. I'll visit you, boy, and we'll talk again. Lay our cards on the table, eh? And then, who knows, but we may be friends. Don't look so despairing, son. I'm not a villain. It's this vile world we live in, boy."
"Newgate jail, sir!"
called the coachman. Mr. Billing sighed, and Smith groaned, while the birds on the Old Bailey and St. Paul's screeched out in high triumph.
Jug him! Jug him!
At last they were about to be obliged. Smith was lodged in the stone hall, but was spared fetters on account of Mr. Billing's having paid the jailer the necessary dues, which charitable act had been accompanied by a whispered, "Don't take it too hard, lad." The only soul to pay him any heed was an old man who'd not seen daylight for 15 years. This queer old fettered bird slept in the fireplace all the year round, save on Christmas Day when the fire was lit, when with much good-natured laughter they shovelled him out, and had come to resemble a dusty ember. He beckoned Smith over with 4 or 5 sharp gestures, and offered to share his strange nest. Salubrious, he said it was, owing to a good downdraft from the chimney. With a clank of his fetters, he pointed upward to the ragged black hole and declared that sometimes a star might be seen, twinkling away like it was sat on Newgate's roof. Next day, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, Smith had visitors.
Miss Bridget and Miss Fanny. He was both pleased and surprised. How had they learned so soon? Miss Bridget sighed bitterly and remarked that bad news travels quick. Dismally, Smith picked at his brass buttons and neat coat.
"Fine clothes and a clean face are but the trappings of shame," went on Miss Bridget, "when the child what has them is so degradingly jugged." "I never done it," said Smith. "You know I never done it." "You're here, ain't you?" said Miss Bridget. "That speaks volumes, don't it? You've done something."
Miss Fanny shivered.
"Oh, Smut, dear, if only you'd given up the document when Lord Tom asked, then there'd be no Surgeons' Hall, nor even them two fierce gents in brown." "Did they come back then?" said Smith.
Yes, they'd come back. And back again. They'd haunted the Red Lion for several days. A terrible pair with eyes like burning coals. Soon, to Smith's great pleasure and pride, Lord Tom joined them. He'd come from paying his respects to his old comrade-in-arms, Dick Mulroon, due to be hanged in a fortnight.
"Well, Smut, me lad, alas, it seems you've forestalled me," he sighed. "Oh, me boy, you go in good company. The best in the world. Poor Dick's the grandest of the roisterers. But maybe Mr. Jones the hangman won't have you yet a while. Maybe Lord Tom can help."
Smith, though not convinced, was sensible of Lord Tom's aim to be cheerful. He looked up with a mournful smile.
"How, Lord Tom?"
"The document, young fellow, do you know where it lies?"
"That I do, Lord Tom."
"And, given certain circumstances, would you lay your hands on it?"
"That I would, Lord Tom, with all me heart."
"Then we'll see, me bright young heart. Dark though these matters be, while Lord Tom's about, there's yet a ray of light."
Lord Tom spread out his strong arms to escort Miss Fanny and Miss Bridget away. A moment later, another visitor came quickly towards him. It was Mr. Billing. "All right, then," said Mr. Billing, sitting down. "Don't trust me, I don't blame you. But I'll tell you here and now, my friend, I've saved your life."
"By having me nubbed?"
said Smith. Mr. Billing shook his head. "They knew you were in Vine Street, Smith."
"Who did?"
"The two men in brown. And they'd have come to murder you if I'd done nothing and left you there."
"Ain't they your friends then, Mr. Billing?"
The attorney looked about him quickly, then bent forward. Yes, indeed, Mr. Billing and the two men in brown had once been concerned with each other.
"Did they have to kill the old man?" said Smith.
The attorney shrugged his shoulders. "Ask Mr. Black, my friend." Smith shivered.
"Oh, was he the other one? The one I heard? The one with the limp?"
"More than a limp, Smith. A wooden leg. Very soft-spoken man. Very devilish. I don't think I'd like to meet with Mr. Black on a dark night." The attorney paused and looked uneasily about him. "Right, my lad. I'll lay my cards on the table. That document's worth money. A vast deal of money. Enough for you and me and our friend Mr. Black. For I tell you, young man, I see no way of keeping him out of it. None. He's got the pair of us, Smith. We're the little running rats, and he's the gobbling devil.
If only, Smith, if only. If only what, Mr. Billing?"
"You and me, Just you and me." "Where did you leave the document?"
"In—"
began Smith. Then something distracted him. The fettered old man. Was he having a fit? He was banging his chained wrists down on the floor. Where, Smith? Where? But Smith had suddenly thought more deeply.
"Lost me memory, Mr. Billing."
"What do you mean?"
"A strain of waiting to be nabbed, Mr. Billing. Can't remember a thing. Leastways, not while I'm here."
Nights in the stone hall were unnaturally long and hard to sleep in. There were continual mutterings and mumblings and sudden cryings out. There was the clinking of leg irons, which sounded, when it was regular, like an endless chain being winched into some deep pit. From far off, from that part of the jail that was called the castle, where wealthy felons and prisoners of state paid high money for their lodging, came the faint sounds of singing and good cheer as Dick Mulroon, the highwayman, was swigged and swilled on his way to his end. On which Smith's ancient fireplace companion would moan and wheeze and finally wake up with a "That's my boy," and jingle into a sitting position from which he'd watch Smith with deceiving bright eyes. "Looking for the Newgate Star?" he'd say, for Smith usually lay with his eyes wide open and fixed on the ragged black hole above. Then the old man would mumble and mutter about Smith's visitors and what they'd had to say. He missed nothing, and it seemed at times as if pecking up scraps of other folks' business was the only thing that kept him alive. Of all Smith's visitors, he was most inquisitive about Mr. Billing, whom he regarded as a real caution of a gent, and one to be handled with the tongs. Mr. Billing had come to see Smith each day, sometimes only for minutes, but at other times for an hour or more. Once he met Miss Bridget and Miss Fanny, and exchanged the briefest of courtesies with them, then left almost directly, saying he'd be out of place in family discussions. Miss Fanny was much impressed by him, and even Miss Bridget had to admit he was quite gentlemanly to the look. He scarce ever referred to the document again, for it was as plain as a pikestaff there'd be no escape without it. Once or twice he spoke of Mr. Black, the man with the wooden leg, but it was only to say that, thank God, that evil man had not shown himself. He hinted of a departure from this place to pastures new, which was being thought of, never fear. Was the other matter likewise in hand? To which Smith had nodded very gloomily indeed. This sadness of his had been carefully observed by the ancient eavesdropper, who taxed Smith with it that night. "You ain't got it, have you?" he said. "Got what?" "What he wants, so you'll have to stay." He looked pleased as Punch at the thought of Smith being his companion forever. "You mind your own business," and Smith glared the old man's beam off his face. His trial was already fixed. January 23rd, the very day they were nubbing Dick Mulroon. Swing out the old, swing in the new, so to speak. The document. The cursed document. Furiously he shut his eyes and tried to picture it, hoping his new skill in reading would reveal from his mind's eye what Mr. Billing wanted to know. But, alas, he could make no more of it now than when he'd looked at it in his darkest ignorance. He wondered if Miss Mansfield had come upon the document yet, and if it had meant anything to her. He sweated with terror at the thought of her giving it to the attorney for nothing. "Oh, God," thought Smith, staring up into the blackness of the chimney as if for an answer. "Why did the old gent have to stuff his pockets with such deadly papers? What right had he to go stumping through the streets heavy with the devil's literature for to tempt the likes of me with?" He shook his head and groaned at the misery of his lot, and wondered if he'd be hanged without ever discovering what he was being hanged for. Smith's hopes were low. Only one held out any promise. Meg, the scullery maid from Vine Street. And then at last she came. She came, even though a heavy fall of snow had begun during the night and was not yet done with. She brought Smith some veal pie, sausage and white bread, also 2 shirts he'd left behind. "You poor thing," she said, giving him the bundle. "Oh, you poor thing." She gazed at him sadly. "They're a-going to hang me, Meg," said Smith. "Oh, you poor thing. There's but one soul who can save me, Meg. Oh, the master." "No, Meg. You." Meg looked astonished. "Say on, little one." So Smith bent close and began to mutter urgently and pleadingly in Meg's large, gentle. "What would me mother have said?
As she rocked herself to and fro, the old man began to rock himself likewise, and then croaked amazingly like the parrot he so closely resembled. "Meg! Meg! Follow your heart, Meg!" She looked startled, then stared with wet eyes at the disreputable old man. She nodded. "That's her voice, child, and them's her words. She often talks to me now she's dead and gone. Sometimes out of old men, sometimes out of mischievous urchins, and sometimes out of heaps of potato peelings. And it's always, 'Follow your heart, Meg.' So I'll fetch you the paper, little Smith, and may it save your poor neck from the shameful noose." Smith considered himself as good as out of the jail, and the change in him was as astonishing as it was abrupt. His high spirits were bewildering to his sisters, who'd last seen him in the depths of gloom. "Oh, Smart," said Miss Fanny, "to see you in such spirits is better than a pint of gin, dear. Now, no matter what befalls, we'll know you went happy." "Oh, I'll be happy going," said Smith enigmatically, and Miss Bridget stared at him sadly, as if he was a lost soul. But Mr. Billing understood. Maybe at first he wondered if Smith had the document already, for he saw the bundle Meg had left and smiled knowingly. Smith, seeing his look, divined its meaning. He shook his head and grinned. "Not yet, Mr. Billing, but it won't be long before the chimney sweep down the road will be situated to buy himself new brooms and a whole new chimney for his very own. If you take my meaning, Mr. Billing." Mr. Billing took his meaning. "And it won't be long before a certain little bird flies out of its stone cage, eh, lad?" He beamed and laid his hand on Smith's thin shoulder. "How much better it is to put our cards on the table, play fair, and be friends. Oh, the world's not such a bad place after all, for the likes of you and me." This was on Sunday, January the 15th, a day remembered, if for no other reason than for the extraordinary violence and passion of its snowstorm. It was as if the devil's cat had got among the angels, and was scattering their feathers everywhere. There seemed no end to the snow, and it continued to fall, sometimes in great whirling quantities, and sometimes, for half a day at a stretch, in idle drifting flakes that wafted wearily down as if the air was filled with invisible obstructions. The days passed, and Smith tried hard to imagine what was preventing Meg. Thursday came and went without a sniff of her. Smith feared Mr. Billing would wax suspicious and impatient, but he never did, and always contrived to remain amiable. On the Friday, Mr. Billing came to Smith with a rueful and disarming smile, sat down, and, to Smith's amazement, relief, and delight, confided the plan for the escape. Not long before, there'd been set up on Newgate's roof a great windmill with vanes a full 20 feet across. Its purpose was to purify the air. As it turned, it drew, by natural suction and skilful design, through tubes and tunnels joining into a middle shaft, much of the foul and pestilential vapours of the jail. With beating heart and glittering eyes, Smith listened as the attorney muttered rapidly on. Dipping his finger fastidiously in Smith's ale, he drew on the tabletop a plan of the wards and halls of the jail alongside which the ventages ran. Very narrow were the lower tunnels, wide enough only to admit a thin child. But on the next floor they were somewhat more spacious. Wider and wider grew these tunnels, till at last they came into the main shaft that rose to the windmill and the heavens. Smith stared at the shining lines and squares that were beginning to dry and lose their powerful meaning. When was he to go? On Tuesday. Tuesday would be a day of great commotion. Dick Mulroon would be setting forth.
Jailers and turnkeys would be busied in keeping order, and too busy to notice a little bird fly out of its cage. Tuesday, at 6 o'clock, before Smith would have been moved to the Sessions House for his trial. Tuesday. Freedom Day. Mr. Billing grinned. Document Day. Smith's wavering spirits lifted, and he stared long and hard at the ventilator grating that was let into the wall beside the fireplace. All that remained, then, was the visit from Meg with the document. Surely she'd not fail him. Not Meg with her monstrous great heart. She didn't fail him, or at least not entirely. She came on the following day. Her shawl, bonnet, skirts, and shoes were loaded with snow. She'd walked the whole way, and the effort had made her steam. But Smith, with a dreadful fear, saw that her dismay was more than snow-deep. Her customarily round face was oval, and her eyes were unnaturally red. "Have you got it, Meg?" She stared at him in terrified sorrow, as if imploring him to hold his peace. "Meg, where is it? Oh, child, oh, little one, they'll hang you now for sure and bury you afore the spring. Oh, you poor thing. Meg, where is it?" "On Thursday. Yes, this Thursday, the master and mistress went out together, so I took me chance, little one, and crept like a mouse to the study. I was in the very room, child, the very room, when I heard a noise from upstairs where you used to sleep. So, quiet as a mouse, I crept out and went up them dreadful stairs. Sure enough, there was noise coming from your own dear room. Scraping, dragging, pulling, panting, like it was being torn apart by dumb beasts. Lord, I was that frightened. I screamed, child, screamed and shrieked till Vine Street echoed. And then it must have scared 'em." "Who?" "Two horrible men in brown. They burst out of the room in a terrible rage. I thought they'd kill me, but they rushed past me and down the stairs, then out through the front door like the wind of hell. So there's no more hope, little one." "No more hope?" Smith looked at her bewildered, having missed the chief part of her bad news. With a groan, she repeated it. The burglary had so alarmed Mr. Mansfield that he'd locked all his papers securely away. There was now no hope in the world of getting at them. "Oh, child, they'll hang you now, and Meg, heart and all, won't be able to stop 'em. Why, child, you're a-smiling." And Smith, in spite of the evil news, was smiling in the most strangely excited way. And when at last she went, promising that she'd try to do something, no matter what, to save him, he called after her, "Thank you, Meg, truly, thank you. You saved my life." Even the old man had been surprised, and he'd thought himself long past such sensations. Aggravated, the old man shuffled close beside him. "You've not got it yet, have you?" "No, I ain't. But nor has he." "So what are you grinning at? And why did you think that sloppy baggage?" "Because that lawyer's got ears as long as Watling Street, and I'd like him to think I'm pleased." The old man chuckled. No matter what the cause, he enjoyed folk being misled. "He thought he'd have me for his dinner," said Smith. "And his friends in brown. Wish I'd seen their faces. Wish I'd seen his face when they told him what luck they'd had." The old man agreed. "And picture his oily face now, when he hears simple little Smith has just thanked Meg heartily. 'Tom Billing,' he'll say to himself, 'you got to help that lad. It stands to reason he's got the document already. Else, why did he thank that sloppy baggage?' Oh, yes, picture his face." The old man pictured it and seemed to enjoy that most of all. On the Monday evening, something happened that frightened the wits out of Smith. Miss Mansfield visited Newgate. A terrible feeling that Mr. Billing had confided the plan to Miss Mansfield, and she, in righteous rage, had come to wreck it, chilled his heart. Miss Mansfield threw back her hood and stared about her in horror and shame. "Smith, you've grown vastly dirty again." "Mr. Jones won't mind." "Who's he?" "The hangman." Impulsively, Miss Mansfield knelt down and stretched out her arms, careless of her cloak whose yellow lining flashed out abrupt as a flower, and took Smith's shoulders.
"Keep off! Keep off!" he cried fearfully, with black memories of his last day in Vine Street and a feeling that Miss Mansfield was come on a worse errand than to tell him he was dirty. The pain that he was inflicting was out of all proportion to his small size. His revenge on the saint of Vine Street, did he but know it, was complete indeed. The lady's face had so distraught and tormented an aspect that even the sneering watchers were struck by it. Suddenly there was a disturbance at the other end of the hall. Turnkeys were shouting. The seething, irritable crowd was being pushed and chivied.
"Blind man! Blind man! Make way!"
It was Mr. Mansfield, blind as night, helplessly upright, his black spectacles in the great gloom looking more than ever like deep holes in his head. The turnkeys pushed obstructions from his path and led him, with many an important scowl at the resentful crowd, towards the fireplace. Miss Mansfield looked alarmed and angry. She'd left her father in the carriage, bade him not come in.
"Daughter!"
"Yes, sir." The blind man nodded and seemed to stare at the wall, as if, even to his useless eyes, the horror, darkness, degradation, and shame of the stone hall was a sight not to be endured.
"Is he here?"
"Yes, sir."
"Smith,"
said Mr. Mansfield.
"do you know what this is?"
He thrust his hand into his coat and drew out the document. A sound between a scream and a groan told Mr. Mansfield that Smith knew. "Meg told us," said Miss Mansfield. "In tears she came, poor soul. She was at her wit's end and said it was the only thing that would save you." Now Smith could read on the outside. "To Mr. Leonard, Billing and Leonard of Curtis Court, Godliman Street." Mr. Mansfield put the paper away.
"Mr. Leonard is at
Pickler's Hill.
I'm taking this document to him, Smith."
What's in it, then?"
"I do not know. It is for Mr. Leonard. A dead man's wish, Smith. Binding. No arguing with it. It shall be delivered tomorrow."
"And let's hope and pray, Smith," said Miss Mansfield, still kneeling, "that it will indeed save you."
"Tomorrow," went on Mr. Mansfield, "Mr. Billing will apply for an adjournment of your trial. I have asked him—"
"Then he knows?" Smith was now in blackest despair. He knew for certain that blind Mr. Mansfield was as marked and doomed a soul as had been Mr. Field. The two men in brown would waylay the magistrate and murder him, and so at last they'd have what they'd been paid to get, and maybe Mr. Black would thank them in his soft voice. "You blind old fool," he said. "They'll kill you, you old madman. Blind right through you are." But Mr. Mansfield and his daughter were already moving, and the turnkeys were clearing their path. It was a strange night, much given over to restlessness and rumours about Dick Mulroon. Rumours that he'd nubbed himself to cheat Mr. Jones. Rumours that he'd been reprieved and was dead drunk on that score. Rumours that he'd changed clothes with a visitor and gone out as the Duchess of Newcastle. Rumours that 20 of his roistering friends had broken in, armed with pistols, muskets and poniards, to whisk him back to the freedom of Hounslow Heath. Then 6:15, or thereabouts, the old man shook Smith and bade him be gone. The stone hall was dark and quiet. Still, as a consequence of the disturbed night. Probably no one was awake save the old man and the furtive boy. "Up on me back," said the old man, and knelt so Smith might mount on that bony eminence to reach the grating. "What if it ain't unlocked?" whispered Smith, full of last-minute dreads and alarms. "It's been done." "When?" "While he slept. I heard. I saw. Come now, up. Up. Smith shook the old man's hand. "I'll not be seeing you more." "I hopes not. Up you go." Smith hoisted himself onto the old man's back, which was as hard and steady as a rock. "Hope you gets a gentleman for the fireplace what suits—" "That's my affair." "No offence." "None took. In you go, you scabby little sparrow." Smith had opened the grating.
The air within was thick and damp and laden with evil smells. For a moment he thought the vent was too narrow even for him. Then he pushed with his feet against the old man's back and felt, first his shoulders, then his arms, elbows and hips scrape the rough stone walls.
"You're in,"
he heard the old man whisper.
"Best of luck."
150 feet of rough, uncanny darkness, divided into 3 steep channels, lay between Smith and the last great shaft. At the juncture of each of these channels, once jagged but now smooth and somewhat slippery, apertures were let in. These led to other parts of the jail and furnished Smith with foot and finger holds to heave himself round each sharp bend and continue his upward burrowing.
"Come on now, me boy,"
he said, and the sound of his own voice cheered him. Henceforward he mocked his trembling spirits aloud, with a curious effect of which he had no knowledge. His mumbling, muttering tones travelled weirdly through devious passages and stony veins, till they were wafted into the deepest and most dreadful parts of the jail. A man in the press-room, on whom were weights past bearing, heard faintly,
"Give in. Not you, me sweeting. What's a bruised belly between friends? On with you."
Other jailbirds in their remote cages heard nothing so heartening. Curses and abuse of the prison's architecture came out of the various gratings, as if Newgate were alive to its own wretchedness, and was at last complaining aloud. Then,
"Be off with you, you fat wicked horror! What are you waiting for, dinner? Be off, or I'll bite your horrible head off!"
Smith and a rat. He'd met it by a nest of vents, its eyes gleaming in some vague, wandering light. It had come from a deeper channel and now stopped, amazed to watch what it took to be a grand relation, passing bulkily by. Farther on, the wandering voice, believed by some to be that of a stoned-up ghost, complained horribly of bruises and swellings got from scrapes and pressures against the ragged, bulging walls. It complained of having taken a wrong turn and finding itself, baffled and helpless, staring through bars into a cage more desolate than the one that had been left. It seemed to be losing heart under the strain of an intolerable journey. So miserable did the voice become at this point, that those who heard it were moved almost to tears. Then nothing more was heard, and the iron-barred vents were as silent as the grave. What had happened? Smith had come into the last great shaft, the broad-ribbed secret gullet that led to the windmill and the sky. Bruised and much fouled from his journeying, he crouched in the last bend and stared triumphantly up. 15 feet above him hung the motionless vanes of the windmill, folded in snow. Beyond was the sky, grey and weighty and still dispensing its flakes, which flickered down and down and down, even kissing Smith's upturned face. A tremendous moment. Not even the Dean of St. Paul's had so fine a view of heaven, nor a more heartfelt gaze at the sky. Smith began to climb. Then he stopped. There was an oddness about the lip of the shaft, a ragged irregularity which seemed to be growing subtly. A sudden gust of wind whipped a veil of snow across his vision, then it was gone, and 2 swellings were most marked. What were they? Heads. 2 men. A pair of hands reached down. Fingers twitched and beckoned. In the sudden and terrible agony of his betrayal, Smith screamed aloud. Looking down upon him, waiting for him, grinning at him, were the 2 men in brown. A moment later, an uproar, as if the lid of hell itself had been lifted, filled the shaft and shrieked and jabbered to the sky. Up from the gratings, through every portage and vent, came the furious and savage voices of the jail's inhabitants, groans from the press-room, curses from the stone hall, hard, high laughter from the master debtors, and shrieks and wild whisperings from holds and wards and cells unknown, all mingled together in a chorus of truly monstrous scope and dimensions. Fearfully the men in brown started at one another. Then they recalled their purpose. They looked down and added their own curses to the dreadful torrent. The boy was gone. Smith
choked, deafened, and despairing, had let go his hold. 8 feet he'd thumped to the bottom of the shaft. Then, his force not spent, he'd slipped squealing down a hole of formidable steepness, a vent that led God knew where. Had Smith been brought up to the church, he'd have had prayer off pat, for he travelled at speed on what he was sure was his last journey. Then, from some 7 feet above the floor, between the pulpit and the open pews of the prison chapel, shot out a dusty, dirty bundle of commotion that howled as it fell, picked itself up, and bolted directly for the door. Smith was back in jail. The chapel was empty, but outside its door was a regular hubbub. The last sermon had just been preached over Dick Mulroon, the highwayman. He was on his way to the hangman's cart. All of his friends, all of his admirers, all of his well-wishers had come to watch him, and now crowded the passages for a last pat on the back, a last sad wave. The crowd was tremendous, more than enough to engulf the scurrying Smith. On all fours he went among skirts and legs that were like a trampling forest. He butted and bit his way along until he came to a corner at the head of some stairs and was momentarily free. "Smart!" came a voice. "It's Smart!" His sisters, come to attend his trial, but had been first dragged by Lord Tom to see the last of the hero of Hounslow Heath. Smith, still on his hands and knees, glared up at his family as though he was their faithful mongrel hound. "Oh, Smart!" said Miss Fanny. "You'll be took and ironed for this." "Quick," said Miss Bridget, handsome in her Tuesday best. "Under my skirt, child. Pop underneath, and not a sound." Miss Bridget tipped her great hoop so's her skirt rose like a monstrous black bell, about to chime against the strongly pantalooned clappers which were her legs. Smith looked briefly at his elder sister and grinned. He darted forward, and Miss Bridget dropped her skirts. So began Smith's escape from Newgate jail, not at all as he dreamed, nor certainly as had been planned for him, but rather a quiet, muffled exit through the great gate itself. True, there were alarms on the way, and some discomforts. Smith found it hard to keep out of the way of Miss Bridget's feet, else she found it hard to prevent herself booting her felonious brother as if for his sins. Miss Fanny also gave cause for alarm by asking aloud if little Smart was all right in his flannel nest, till Miss Bridget was heard to declare aloud, "You're a foolish cow, Fan! Hold your tongue for pity's sake!" Then Lord Tom joined them. Smith would have known those sturdy feet anywhere, and Miss Fanny couldn't resist whispering, "We've got him safe and sound. You'll never guess where, Lord Tom. Not in 1,000 years." By the time they got to Turnmill Street, it was hard on 10 o'clock. As Miss Bridget raised her skirt a trifle to step across the familiar door of the Red Lion Tavern, there was a faint shouting and roaring that seemed to be coming from a long way off. "What's that, Lord Tom?" said Miss Fanny. The highwayman sighed.
"From Tyburn, my dear. They've just nabbed Grand Dick Mulroon. I'm the only one left, Fanny. When will it be my turn?"
If ever a man could tell, to the nearest 5 minutes, how long it would take a particular coach, leaving a particular part of the town and going north, to come to the edge of Finchley Common, that man was Lord Tom. Not your fat, rumbling trundler, nor your light-slung gig passing northward through the town, was capable of keeping Lord Tom waiting upon his wild and lonely hunting ground. He knew their paces as well as his own, and boasted famously that his prizes came, so to speak, by prompt appointment.
"Given the size of the coach, as you've described it, given this weather, given the crowds for Dick Mulroon this day, given the starting from Vine Street, your Mr. Mansfield will take luncheon at the Queen's Head in Lamb's Cundit Fields, and come upon the common at 4:30 o'clock. 'Tis certain, Smart. Sure as we're in this cellar, sure as my name is Lord Tom. At 4:30, and at 5... He paused,
his finger raised, like he was hailing a chair.
At 5, Lord Tom?
We'll have him.
Miss Fanny looked at her friend admiringly, but Smith was yet doubtful.
Yes, Lord Tom, if someone else don't have him first.
Lord Tom sighed and scratched his cheek, then examined the hand he'd employed.
Do you mean our two friends in brown?
Smith shivered and nodded.
Lord Tom will see them off smart, said Miss Fanny. You'll see.
And Lord Tom, with a mighty scowl, agreed.
I'll blow blue daylight through 'em, smut. There's never a man yet who's dared come tween Lord Tom and his lawful prize. You'll see 'em scamper, my lad.
And then our document at last. The document, said Miss Bridget suddenly. How I hate and despise it. It's brought an old man to his death, and now it's turned our own poor mite, what has never sinned deeper than a passing pocket, into a dwarfish Toby, to take such a child onto the murdering common for to rob a blind man. Oh, for shame!
Lord Tom stood up and began to pace the cellar.
What would you have me do, Miss Bridget? In your own very hearing, not an hour ago, in this very residence, I've pleaded with him, I've begged him, I've warned him, and I've supplicated with him not to come. But that lad's determined. Nothing anyone can say will shake him. He's iron, Miss Bridget. He's steel. He's rock. He's a fixture, ma'am.
Smith, who felt as far from any of these things as was imaginable, nodded vigorously. Since he'd left the dreadful jail in the vinegary, rustling blackness of his sister's skirt, with her legs coming and going like engines of destruction, he'd thought of nothing but Mr. Mansfield with the fatal document on his way to Bickler's Hill. Miss Bridget had turned the full force of her tongue upon Lord Tom, but Miss Bridget's tempest could never have sunk Lord Tom in Smith's bright eyes, for the boy held the green-cloaked robber in the deepest admiration and respect, which respect, agreeably enough, was treasured by Lord Tom as a bright, warm day to remember in the winter of his life. With energy and dignity he painted such a picture of his trade that only the coldest of hearts could have scorned.
Gallantry, ma'am! There's gallantry on the common, and fierce beauty, and soaring adventure.
The highwayman's eyes sparkled, and he brushed the back of his hand across his cheek, as if he could feel the wild night upon it. Then he went on to relate exploits that he'd told of many times before, but never so handsomely. And he spoke of other famous gentlemen who'd once waited, hid, and pounced, where he now waited, hid, and pounced.
Duval,
Hanged,
snapped Miss Bridget.
Turpin,
hanged,
Captain Robinson.
hanged.
Yes, ma'am, they paid for their joys. They are dead and gone, and so have a great many other folk. 'Tis the common penalty for living. But it's not the quiet, mewing, moaning, bed-perishings that haunt the common of a moony night. No, ma'am. When we ride out, we ride with the great ghostly company of the Nubbed. Many a time I've heard, Lord Tom, Lord Tom, I'm a-watching you, friend, in Turpin's own voice.
Then Lord Tom, with dreamy grandeur, told of these dead men's doings in the days of their lives, and then back to his own, to draw a parallel, then back again, till it was hard to tell who'd done what, Duval, Robinson, Turpin, or Lord Tom. At last Lord Tom pulled out a fine French watch that had been the subject of his last told adventure.
Well, Smut, me comrade in arms of this day, are we fit and ready? 5 minutes to make your adieus, Smut. Then it's the common for the pair of us.
With mounting excitement, Smith left his seat and stationed himself beside the tremendous highwayman, when Miss Bridget, somewhat desperately, protested.
But he'll freeze to death. He cannot go so ill-dressed.
There was a further delay, while an ancient cloak was found to cover Smith's bedraggled finery, and a queer hat that Miss Fanny had once toyed with to cover his tangled and matted hair. He had a certain shabby splendour, and even Miss Bridget gazed at him with surprise and a reluctant admiration as he began to mount the stairs. Smith, caught up in the romantic spirit, felt himself full of the gallantest dreams. He turned and waved and called,
"Adieu, dear ladies." "I'll guard him, ma'am," said Lord Tom. "With me very life, I do assure you. While he's with Lord Tom, no danger will offer. I promise you, ma'am. Come, lad. Away!"
So they rode out, this weirdly romantic, fantastic pair, the infant jailbird and the glowering highwayman, through the thick snow towards the famous place where Lord Tom and all of his hanged ghosts waited, hid, and pounced. The snow, which had held off for some 3 hours, began again in earnest at about 4 o'clock, as the light was perishing from the sky, and there came up to Bob's Inn on the steep of Highgate Hill a most weary horse, bearing a full-sized man and an undersized boy.
"Is this the place, Lord Tom?"
"The very same."
Bob's Inn, a pleasant, newly built structure with 3 parlours and rooms for 7 gentlemen, 3 double and 1 single, sat about 50 yards northward from the top of Highgate Hill, and commanded a spacious view of the southern fingers of Finchley Common, from which it was distant by about half a steep mile. Thus, from the snug windows, not a curricle, gig, or coach could venture onto the common without being interestedly viewed. For the further entertainment of his customers, Bob had provided a strong spyglass, at 6d. a half hour, and certain information that might be of service. Mr. Bob's customers were high Tobies to a man.
"Knew 'em all,"
was Mr. Bob's proud boast as he stood by the cheerful fire of an evening.
"Duval, Turpin, Robinson. Many's the time they've sat about this very snug, drinking and laughing and popping to the windows for a nifty look."
This notwithstanding the glum fact that Duval had been hanged 80 years before, and Bob looked no more than 40.
"Yes, indeed, knew 'em all."
He welcomed Lord Tom and grinned affectionately at Smith, whom he recognised as
"A brisk, bright and prosperous apprentice to the trade."
He made a place for the highwayman and his apprentice by the fire, and dispatched an evil-eyed potboy for jars of the best.
"Nothing coming, nothing going,"
he said, jerking his head to the windows that commanded the best view of the common.
"Not our sort of weather, eh, Lord Tom? Many's the time great Duval himself would curse the snow for muffling his pickings. Aye, and a warming his backside where you're a warming yours, friend."
Lord Tom was handsomely thawing himself out, and fizzing and drizzling into the hearth. Likewise, Smith, buffeted and stung by the whirling snow, bruised beyond belief by the dreadful horse, began to come to himself and crack and thaw and ease himself into a furtive smile.
"There's a coach due, Bob, within—"
Lord Tom drew out his French watch, which the landlord eyed merrily.
"Within this half hour, from town toward Barnet. You know best, friend, you got a reputation. But it surprises me, yes, indeed. Must be powerful business to draw an equipage across this murderous white nothingness." "It is, Bob. It surely is."
Not 50 yards to the west of Bob's stood another inn, an ancient, tottery, smoky building, the speaking likeness of Smith's Red Lion. This was the Wrestlers. It seemed that Lord Tom had a little brief business there. He charged Smith to wait for him and not to stir from Mr. Bob's parlour, under no circumstances.
"Watch out for the coach, Smat. Mr. Bob will show you where. Here's a 6d, Bob. Let the lad watch through the spyglass. Let him be a real high Toby while I'm gone. Just for 10 minutes, eh?"
With a quick wave, he opened the door, and his place was took by a flurry of snow as he strode across the invisible road to the Wrestlers.
"A grand fellow," said Bob. "One of the best."
Smith stared out into the gathering night, past the ghostly reflection of his own thin, fierce face,
through the snow-filled air onto the deep white world that sank and humped and valleyed and hillocked for many a quiet, mysterious mile. This was northward. Southward lay the town, speckled and spotted with lights.
"Do you see that long, shadowy finger?" said Mr. Bob. "That's the road the coach will come by. If it comes."
Smith saw, and raised the spyglass so as the landscape jumped amazingly close at hand. Then, distant even in the spyglass, he saw a square, black creature with a pair of gleaming yellow eyes tipping and lumbering in the wake of two horses.
"It's coming," said Smith. "Lord Tom had best be quick."
He turned to the side window and swung the spyglass towards the wrestlers to see if the romantic figure of the highwayman was yet come out and was leaning through the whirling weather. It was amazing. So strong was the glass that Smith felt he could have touched the door and walls and poked his head through the parlour window to say, "Make haste, Lord Tom, the coach is sighted. Hurry, good friend of mine, get up off your chair and leave those—" Those what? For there sat Lord Tom, large and near as life, leaning across a table, in deep discussion with— Smith lowered the spyglass abruptly and wiped the lens. Then he looked again. He grew pale. His skin began to prickle as if the air was full of thorns and arrows. His belly turned unquiet, and he began to feel sick. Lord Tom was in deep discussion with the two men in brown. A very black, bitter, and tragic place was the world to Smith as he understood the scope of his friend's treachery. It was not Miss Fanny's prattling that had betrayed his whereabouts, but the whispers of gallant Lord Tom. The blind man's turning against him was as nothing to the wretchedness he now endured. Smith had been struck deep indeed.
"I'll fetch you a tot of brandy, lad,"
said Bob, much concerned, and believing the apprentice to be, so to speak, the victim of stagecoach fright.
"That'll put fire into you for the stand and deliver."
He was gone only a second, but when he returned the door was banging open and the parlour was empty, save for a whirl of snow. The highwayman's apprentice was gone. In places the snow lay 2 feet deep, and Smith, to rise out of it, had to bound in a mighty springing fashion, like a tremendous flea. Such tracks as he made were almost instantly filled in after him, so that the effect of his progress was oddly supernatural. And all the while, in a harsh, sobbing voice, he'd plead and cajole and curse and beg his own despairing person to hurry, hurry, hurry! Where to? The road the coach would take, the shadowy finger that Mr. Bob had pointed to. Where was it? He stared about him. Whiteness everywhere. No landmark, no post, nothing. A feeling of hopelessness gripped him. He looked back up the hill. 3 small black figures were on their way. In a sudden rage, Smith stamped his foot and glared about him. Not 70 yards off lumbered the coach. Towards him! The road! He was on it! The horses panted and dragged and steamed. The coachman, high up on his snow-capped black mountain, leaned forward, eyes fairly glued to the vague shadow which was all he could see of firm ground. He dared not look elsewhere. One false move might end in a drift and finish the vital journey then and there. Smith scrambled aside, sank up to his knees in snow, crouched low down. On came the coach, its yellow lamps leaping like alarmed eyes as it rocked perilously, all haste and commotion, yet soundless. The snow and the wind muffled all. It might have been a spectral equipage, already lost some way back and only its spirit persisting. Now it was close enough for Smith to pick out the coachman's features. His one-time master in the Vine Street yard. He heard the horses thumping in the snow, and the harness groan and creak in the angry singing of the air. Still he waited. The coach drew level. A friendly gust of wind whipped and whirled and sent stinging flakes into the coachman's eyes and face. Smith moved quickly. He seized hold on the door, dragged it open.
"Who's there? Who is it?"
Mr. Mansfield's voice, angry and alarmed, was swallowed up in the wind. Smith reached within. He clutched at a coat sleeve, a wrist, a hand, and pulled with all his might.
"My God! My God!"
Out heaved the blind man, falling with the tilt of the coach into the muffling snow.
For God's sake, who is it? What do you want with me?
Smith, still holding tight, did not answer. Instead, he dragged him down into the drifts by the side of the road, while the untenanted coach, its door swinging helpless like a one-armed soldier's sleeve, quaked and jolted on. Again the blind man cried out, and Smith fixed his hand over the betraying mouth. 20 yards on, the coach rocked to a halt. It had been accosted, and pistols pointed the way to the coachman's brains. The wind whipped voices back to where the snow was fast hiding Smith and his prisoner.
The lousy coach is empty! That boy of yourn, Lord Piddling Tom, he's beat us to it. You should have slit his mean throat, you green windbag. Friends! Friends! How was I to know? You swore you'd fix him. And so I meant to. I swear it. Swear it to Mr. Black. If he gives you leave, you'll bleed for this. No, no. They must be near at hand. Let's search. In this great howling blizzard. Yes, yes. We've had experience afore. Your little rat there killed us once with chasing him.
Smith, in concealment, couldn't restrain a beam of pride.
Then what's to be done? On to Mr. Black in the morning. That's what... The coach! The coach!
While they'd been thus engaged, the coachman had taken advantage. He'd whipped his horses and yelled them into a frenzy. Already the coach heaved and plunged on its way.
Stop, you fool! Stop, or you're dead!
Lord Tom raised his pistol, aimed, and fired. A cry from ahead. The coachman, high up, clutched at his side and began to slip. Then he seemed to recover himself partly, and was lost from sight behind a clump of trees. When the coach reappeared, still lumbering fast, there was nothing on the box but a heavy, jerking shape that any moment would fall by the wayside, unheeded. Smith, in his excitement, had withdrawn his hand from the magistrate's mouth.
Is he killed?
Said Mr. Mansfield. Smith did not answer. Instead, with bitter, lonely eyes, he watched the 3 figures turn and begin their climb up the hill. Then he stood up, brushed the accumulated snow from the magistrate's shoulders and head, and pulled him to his feet. 4 miles to the north lay Prickler's Hill. Smith set his face in that direction and, with his hand firmly about the blind man's wrist, began to walk. And the snow came down like a disaster. They made poor progress. In 2 hours, something less than 3/4 of a mile. Every once in a while the boy would turn his back to the weather and face the blind man, drawing him on and, at the same time, seeming to retreat under the impassive stare of the snow-stained face. Sometimes, when they passed among the heavily bandaged trees, the wind would dislodge snow from the lower branches so that it thumped down, knocking the breath out of the 2 travellers and forcing them to halt for recovery. Then the blind man would once more ask his guide who he was, and why he'd saved him and was leading him through this huge and bitter night. Perhaps he knew. It was hard to say.
Very well, then. Speak. Anything. Anything at all. Or are you dumb? Oh, a fine pair, we two. One with no tongue to tell what he sees, and the other with no eyes to see what's worth telling.
But Smith uttered never a word. He was deeply frightened of the magistrate's mania for justice. He dreaded that the blind man would give him up at the first opportunity.
So let him think it's a perishing angel what's leading him,
thought Smith, and held his tongue. At 7 o'clock the snow began to abate, though the wind did not, and a great clearness and brilliancy settled upon the landscape, across which the boy and the blind man seemed to be the only moving things. Magistrate, having worn out his conversation, turned to singing and chanting, maybe in the hope that this silent guide would join in and betray himself. The thought struck him that Mr. Mansfield
knew who he was all the time and was subtly mocking him, till the chance should offer of giving him up. Certainly everything the blind man said seemed now to be cruelly humorous, and he said a great deal. Song and poems and lumps of the scriptures came puffing out of his mouth, with much issue of smoking breath. This was Mr. Mansfield's stock in trade. His vision of the world seen through other men's eyes. Suddenly he felt the grip on his wrist disappear. Frightened, he stopped, turning his face this way and that in the lonely wind. Had he been left? Oh, God! Why? Smith, beaten breathless by the weather, with a lock of his black hair frozen solid so as it banged against his forehead like a door-knocker, was suddenly attacked by common sense. The old mole in the hole was not changed. Stern and cold was his face, colder even than the snow that spotted him. Smith was not leading him. He was leading Smith back into the horrible house of bondage. 1,000 windy voices shouted in his ears, bidding him leave the old justice and be gone. Further and further off backed Smith, amazed by his own madness in coming thus far. He stared at the stark, menacing form of the blind man with his stony heart. And then, as Smith watched, the blind man raised his hands. He turned about, tried to take a step, stumbled, recovered himself, and called,
"Am I alone? Am I alone?"
His face, though much limited in expression by his shrouded eyes, was suddenly and deeply wretched. A desolate face, bespeaking a starved soul.
"You old blind justice, you," said Smith, lurching back to Mr. Mansfield. "Give us your hand, then."
The magistrate stretched out his hands, and Smith took them.
Here, then. Both me hands. You ain't alone, Mr. Mansfield. Nor never was. I was only resting. Smith? Smith?
Said the blind man, grasping in return the hands he'd never forgotten.
Your voice at last. How I longed to hear it. You knew it was me, then? Yes. Yes. Then why didn't you say? You didn't want me to know, did you? No. I was thinking you'd hand me over to the law. And even so you came back? I'm only a human being.
They stumbled on a while longer, but no more in silence. A curious warmth seemed to have sprung up between them and rendered the wind less savage. Mr. Mansfield told Smith that his daughter had stayed behind to attend his trial and to keep Mr. Billing to his promise of the adjournment. It seemed it was she, the saint of Vine Street, who had kept her faith in Smith.
Not you, Mr. Mansfield,
said Smith.
No, alas, not me. I'm no saint, Smith. Like you, I'm only a human being.
So they went on their way, talking together. Smith chattered about what he could see and what he'd seen, describing his life and the doings of his sisters, and even his escape from jail. But he never mentioned Lord Tom, nor any of the darkness that hemmed him in. Likewise, Mr. Mansfield, though he confided in Smith much of his warmer past, said nothing of what must have lain deepest in both their thoughts, the murder of Mr. Field. Presently they reached the top of a gentle slope.
Cottage, Mr. Mansfield. 1/4 mile off. Light in the window. Nice, snug little place. Looks warm. What say we knock on the door?
Don't mind if we do.
Smith tucked his head as far as it would go into his collar and began the descent toward the cottage which lay in a snow-filled hollow. A neat, well-built cottage, with good windows and stout fence marking off its garden from the common. Though, with the snow lying so heavy on garden and common alike, the fence looked more peevish than necessary. There was a strong blossoming of smoke from the chimney that bespoke a warmer nature within than without, and the cottage's windows gleamed most cheerfully. All this Smith described to Mr. Mansfield, who nodded as they approached the door and said he was reminded of old fairy tales.
"Oh, a woodchopper's cottage. An old woodchopper and his brown-eyed wife."
Smith knocked at the door. The door opened an inch.
"Who's there? What do you want?"
"Shelter," said Smith and Mr. Mansfield together.
"Who for?"
"A blind man and a frozen child."
What was that?
Came a woman's voice from within.
"Blind man and frozen child."
Stuff and nonsense, Charlie. Have a look.
The door opened to the full extent of its chain. A stout, waistcoated man, bald and frowning, peered out.
"Man and child right enough, Mrs. P."
See if he's blind,
came Mrs. P's voice. Obligingly, Mr. Mansfield took off his spectacles and presented his face.
"Blind all right."
Then let him in, Charlie,
called Mrs. P.
Keeping a blind man and a frozen child on your doorstep. Ain't you got no humanity, sir? Oh, you're a weak vessel, Charlie Parkin.
Thereupon the chain was unfastened, the door opened wide, and Smith and Mr. Mansfield welcomed directly into the parlour.
Hats, coats, boots, called Mrs. P. Charlie?
Charlie collected up those snowy articles, which were already dripping fast in the great heat of the parlour, and bustled out while Mrs. P., a very small woman with sharp features and a blue cap, fixed Smith and Mr. Mansfield on either side of the neat fire. Indeed, everything about the parlour was neat. The cloth upon the table was neatly embroidered with neat little flowers. The plates upon that cloth were neat, and even the crumbs remaining on those plates had been neatly arranged, like soldiers drawn up for review. "A very neat home," said Smith to Mr. Mansfield.
"You poor things,"
said Mrs. P., busy by the sideboard with glasses and some warming spirits.
"Lost your ways on the common, I suppose?"
"Our coach was held up, ma'am,"
said Mr. Mansfield.
"Highwayman."
"Fetch the book, Charlie,"
shouted Mrs. P. Charlie vanished back into the kitchen and reappeared with spectacles and a large ledger.
"Now, Charlie, off you go. Blind man and boy."
And Charlie repeated it, and slowly, with much help from his fumbling tongue, wrote it in the book.
"Held up. Where was you held up?"
"On the common, ma'am."
"On the common, Charlie?"
"On the common, Mrs. P. 2 M's and 1 N.
"Robbed?"
"No, ma'am."
"Not robbed, Charlie."
Charlie wrote, and Mrs. P. sighed at her husband's slowness.
"Injured?"
"Our coachman was murdered, I believe,"
said Mr. Mansfield.
"Coachman murdered, Charlie."
Charlie looked up and exchanged a long, deep stare with Mrs. P. Then he shook his head.
"Them damned high tobies."
Now Mrs. P. came over with 2 glasses of spirits.
2 measures of brandy, Charlie," she called out as she offered them.
2 measures of brandy," wrote Charlie. "And 2 suppers to follow, Mrs. P."
2 suppers, Charlie, and 2 seats by the fire for the night."
She turned to her guests.
"Nothing but chairs remaining."
Charlie finished his writing and looked up.
"Names? What names, please?"
"Mansfield,"
said the magistrate.
"Mr. Mansfield, Justice of the Peace, sir."
"A magistrate? Fancy that, Mrs. P. Well, well, sir, it seems we are in the same line of business, for I'm a constable, among other things. Yes, sir, here to keep law and order, and let me tell you, sir, everything's recorded, accounts square and trim. 2 measures brandy offered, 2 measures of brandy writ down, 2 measures of brandy back from the parish. Not a drop more, not a drop less."
Charlie had been about to put the ledger away when a thought struck him.
"A lad's name, sir?"
Servant of yourn?
A friend, said Mr. Mansfield.
A friend. Name?
said Charlie, his pen poised like a sword.
Jones,
said Mr. Mansfield. Smith, the escaped and no doubt hunted jailbird, regarded the perjured magistrate with the warmest affection and surprise. Charlie looked to Mrs. P.
Shall we show why we got no bed to spare, Mrs. P? Parish business, Charlie, you ain't got the right. But he's a justice, Mrs. P. And he's blind. Very well, Charlie, as he's blind.
Whereupon the sentimental constable chuckled and reopened the ledger, which he carried to Mr. Mansfield's side.
There was someone before you, sir, whom we took in.
generous, sir, generous.
He was bleeding.
Who was he?
Your coachman, sir. Yes, indeed. We've succoured him and nourished him and put him to bed.
Thank God, thank God.
Here it is, went on Charlie, proud to have been of service to humanity, the parish, and a justice of the peace. And forthwith he read out the coachman's name, wound, where sustained, quantity of bandage applied, sustenance consumed, and quality of lodging, together with the care of horses and use of coach-house, all of which was chargeable to the parish. Then the ledger was put away, and Mrs. P. busied herself with fetching hot suppers for her guests, while her husband expressed the hope that Mr. Mansfield would bring his vigilance to the ears of all his legal friends in town. At about 10 o'clock the Parkins went to bed, and left their guests to doze and brood in their chairs beside the banked-up fire.
It's been a long day,
said Mr. Mansfield. Long day, said Smith.
A lifetime long.
Smith said nothing, but fancied he understood. Slowly Mr. Mansfield's head sank down on his chest, and his fine, strong face glowed in the firelight. Smith stared at him profoundly.
Smith?
Mr. Mansfield was still awake. He'd taken off his spectacles and was staring to where he supposed Smith to be. He was smiling. He fumbled inside his waistcoat.
Here, Smith. Isn't this something you wanted? Take it, then. Read it. Aloud, I beg you.
He was offering Smith a document. The document. All the time in the snow, when he and Mr. Mansfield had been alone, the precious item had been within his grasp, and he'd forgotten it. Forgotten it so entirely that its sudden appearance before the cottage fire was almost terrifying.
Take it, Smith, and tell me what old Mr. Field had to say.
Fearfully, Smith reached out his hand and took the document.
Read it, Smith. Don't be afraid. Read.
So Smith crouched down at the blind man's feet, close by the fire where the light was sufficient. And as he sat, Mr. Mansfield's hand dropped by chance on his shoulder, then moved lightly upward and rested on his head. Smith read, slowly, shakily, for he was not over-proficient, and the writing was crabbed, and there were words he could not pronounce. It was a letter to Mr. Leonard, a strange letter of an uncanny power in the firelit room. For as Smith read on, murdered old Mr. Field seemed to creep into the parlour and cast his cold shadow between the blind man and the boy. The old man had written in deep agitation. He knew his life to be threatened. Several times he mentioned it.
I lie awake of nights, Leonard, and hear such sounds, and have such thoughts, at my age.
Then later he wrote of a discovery he'd made, but did not say what, only that he meant to carry it to his grave. A terrible discovery. This also was repeated and underlined.
A terrible, terrible discovery.
But now came an oddity, an instruction quite plain and without any of the confused fears that invaded the rest of the document.
The trifle
was underlined.
I wrote you of previously
is buried in a shrewd place. Andrews knows where. Ask him where Jack used to play as a boy. When you have it, dispose of it as pleases you. I shall care no longer."
Smith stopped reading. There was a restless silence in which the fire leapt and cast strange lightnings across the blind man's face.
"Go on,"
said Mr. Mansfield.
"There's nothing more."
He scowled furiously into the fire. The document, the precious item that was to have raised him up in the world. Nothing but an old man's misery and dread and the whereabouts of a trifle. A locket, most likely, or a brooch with a twist of his grandma's hair. For this he'd endured so much. He stared at the paper, through which the fire shone redly, and noted the stains made by his own sweat when first he'd fled from the men in brown. Then he remembered his grief when he'd thought that the document had been destroyed, and then his joy when he'd discovered it was safe. He remembered Miss Fanny's hopes in it, and that the old man had been killed for it. And now...
"The discovery," said Mr. Mansfield. "What was it?"
"Took it with him to the grave," said Smith.
Mr. Mansfield shook his head.
"We must know it, Smith. There'll be no peace otherwise."
"You find out on your own, Mr. Mansfield. I'm done with it. I'm off."
"But I'm blind, Smith. I need your eyes."
"Well, your daughter's eyes are just as sharp."
Mr. Mansfield frowned.
"What did you hope for from the document? What was it, Smith, that you struggled so hugely for?"
Smith did not answer, because he'd never had a clear notion of what he'd hoped for, save to make his way up in the world. Mr. Mansfield waited, seeming to stare into the fire. Little by little his head sank once more onto his chest. Smith watched him. Surely he was asleep. Maybe half an hour passed.
"Smith."
"I'm here."
"I thought you'd gone. You said you were going. Have you changed your mind?"
"I'll go in the morning."
Once more there was silence. A long silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the blind man's regular breathing. Desolately, Smith stared at the unlucky document. The words jiggled and danced before his tired eyes. Why had the old man been killed? What had he discovered? The blind man had been right. There'd be no peace for Smith till he knew. And little by little, as he sat by the small fire, the desire to uncover the mystery of Mr. Field's dread became as strong as his first desire to read the document itself. No more snow had fallen in the night, and now a bloodless, bewildered-looking sun stood poised on the eastern hills, as if one nudge of a cloud would topple it into snowy oblivion. Smith and Mr. Mansfield were on the last stage of their singular journey to Prickler's Hill, and Smith was as watchful as a hawk. He sat atop the coach beside the wounded coachman, who was now recovered enough, he swore, to hold the reins in his right hand. They skirted the village of Whetstone, and still no sign of pursuers.
"The house!"
said the coachman, jerking his head towards the eminence of Prickler's Hill. The house, built in the Palladian style, stood a third of the way up the hill, sheltered from the north by rising ground, and separated from Whetstone by an old stone church, whose yard, shrouded by snow, was the very image of white and peaceful sleep. The coach could go no further. The road was steep and vilely slippery. The horses steamed and laboured in vain.
"On foot, then,"
said Mr. Mansfield, and he bade the coachman return into Whetstone while he and Smith went forward alone.
"Pistols, Mr. Mansfield? Shall I take 'em?"
The magistrate shook his head.
The gentlemen from Highgate Hill seem to have given up. No need for weapons now."
Smith shrugged his shoulders, took Mr. Mansfield's hand, and began the last ascent. Though he could see nothing uneasy anywhere in the white landscape, he could not rid himself of the feeling that they were being watched closely. Where from? The house? The village? Or from the quiet churchyard? He said nothing of this to Mr. Mansfield, there being no sense in alarming the blind man without just cause. Instead, he listened and commented as Mr. Mansfield talked of Mr. Field and his unlucky life. He learned, with but half a mind, about the disappearance and most likely death of Mr. Field's only son some years before, which had been followed by so relentless a siege of the old man and his property by his brothers, their wives and children, that—
"That what, Mr. Mansfield?"
That there were suspicions, grim suspicions, that the eager family knew more than they said about the son's death.
Though Mr. Field was now many weeks dead, there was still a bereaved air about his house. Dogs barked as the blind man and the boy trudged along the short, curved drive, but no one bade them be quiet or came to see why they barked. 5 yards from the door, Smith faltered.
"What is it? The cold?"
"Freezing,"
said Smith. He'd fancied that he'd seen a movement in the churchyard which lay below them. The barking of the unseen dogs grew louder, and to Smith it seemed they were warning, not the house, but the blind man and him to keep away, to abandon whatever it was that had brought them across the snow. But it was too late. They'd been seen approaching. The tall door opened and a footman received them. At the sound of the door the dogs fell silent and the footman nodded.
"The master's beasts, sir. There's no hushing them till they hear the door. The ignorant creatures still believe he'll come back, and only when they hear the door do they understand he's not come yet. For he always went to them first. Poor ignorant beasts. God help them."
The footman was old, but still upright. He took Mr. Mansfield's card and lowered his eyes to read it, as if to avoid the blind man's stare.
"Oh, yes, of course. I should have known you. You've been before. Long ago."
Now they were in the hall of Mr. Field's house, and Smith stared about him. But the walls betrayed nothing, only some ghostly pale patches where pictures had once hung.
"Grand paintings used to be there," said the servant, seeing Smith's looks. "I remember them," said Mr. Mansfield. "I remember King Saul and David." "Aye, sir. That was the first to go. Sold, sir. To pay the butcher, the baker, and—"
"And the chimney sweep down the road?"
said Smith. The servant shrugged.
"If you will, lad. The chimney sweep down the road, whoever he may be."
"A gent with a wooden leg."
At this, the old servant seemed to stiffen and lose what little colour the years had left him. Then he recovered. An angry look came into his eyes, and Smith knew he'd made an enemy of the old man. But for the life of him he couldn't imagine why. Mr. Mansfield inquired for Mr. Leonard, but it seemed the attorney went Barnet and would not be at the house till midday. Indeed, there was no one in the house but Miss Field, the dead master's sister, and 2 of the nephews.
"The others are with Miss Leonard, sir. They're always with Mr. Leonard. They give him no peace, sir, not even to conduct the business. He stayed here, sir, for 2 nights, but he had to leave. They were at him all the while. Poor souls, for they're in need even of the necessary penny to bless themselves with."
They were now come into the chief drawing-room, a long, handsome apartment with tall windows giving out onto the church and whetstone beyond it. There was a fire in the grate, but it burned cheerlessly, with uneasy flames and little heat. Here, too, there were ghosts on the walls, and a small writing table by one of the windows. Was it here he'd written of the discovery that had sent him hurrying to the town? Smith stared sombrely out of the window towards the churchyard. Once more he had the feeling of being secretly watched. The servant assisted Mr. Mansfield to a chair, which the blind man, being unused to the hands that were guiding him, felt carefully and exactly. He frowned. The upholstery was much torn. A strange state of affairs in so short a time since the master's death. But it was not that chair alone. Everywhere in the room cushions and seats were in a grievous state, with their white insides peeping forth for all the world as though the wild, pervasive snow had crept into the house and hid itself everywhere.
"Aye," said the servant. "'Tis the same everywhere. You'll not find a cushion, chair covering, nor bolster unslit, nor a floorboard unopened. The family have been hard at it, for they've a heathenish belief there must have hid a great fortune somewhere against the chance of poor dead Jack's returning. But Jack will come back when his father does, and that will be at the judgment of us all, not a day before. Aye, and then the beasts will bark and bark."
"But where did Jack play as a boy?" suddenly wondered Smith, with an excitement that had been steadily mounting within him as he remembered the document's injunction. Now the servant, after brushing some ash from the hearth, on which the fire looked more wretched than ever, left the room to announce Mr. Mansfield to Miss Field. Smith and the blind man were alone. Smith seized his hand urgently. "We'd best ask Andrews where Jack played as a boy."
"Why, do you still have your hopes?" "Oh, if so, forget them, Smith. We'll wait for Mr. Leonard. This is his affair alone."
The blind man regretted profoundly what he'd said. But there was no other way. Though he trusted Smith with his very life, he could not trust him with the dead man's secret. He dreaded the boy would be off, never to be found again in the dark world, save to be hanged.
"Where are you now?"
he said.
"By the fire." "Oh, yes, yes. Why did you ask? I thought you were over there."
He pointed to the windows.
"I thought you were staring at me."
But before Smith could answer, Miss Field came hurriedly into the room. She was a gaunt-boned, elderly lady, large, though frail and anxious-looking. She rustled tremendously as she moved, like great sweepings of autumn leaves.
"Mr. Mansfield. Kate Field, at your service, sir. Sad times, Mr. Mansfield. A brother dead, the family penniless. Sell, sell, sell. But we must, to live, you know. But how's dear little Rose? It is Rose, isn't it, sir?"
The blind man nodded, and she went breathlessly on, shifting about the room, even picking at the ruined furnishings, like a large black moth in search of a meal. She faintly resembled her murdered brother, and this touched Smith curiously, so that, when she returned, as she often did, to the family's distress and disappointed hopes and desperation for money, he could not share the blind man's indifference. Why shouldn't the silly old woman long for money? Abruptly, Miss Field realized she was not recommending herself to anyone but the curious urchin the magistrate had brought with him. She cast a rapid, melancholy smile at Smith, and began to talk hurriedly and sadly about the dead man.
"Yes, yes. A sad life, my brother's. A tragedy, Mr. Mansfield. Never, never for a day did he get over the loss of Jack. Never accepted it. The shock, I suppose. Always expected him to come riding up the drive. Tragic. Not a worthy son. Not likeable. Though I was his aunt, I say it, and God forgive me, he's better off dead. Our tragedy, Mr. Mansfield. It's all our tragedy. Everyone turns against us. Even Attorney Leonard. Oh, I can tell. He turns away. He frowns. He would not stay here. God knows what he thinks of us all. And all on account of the money. Oh, where can it be? God knows we've searched."
She stared at the torn furnishings.
"Oh, it's cruel. And yet it must be somewhere. Oh."
She stopped as a far-off tumbling was heard.
"My nephew's in the attic, sir. I must go. Pray to God they've found something. Pray to God."
She was already halfway through the door when she remembered her responsibilities.
"Do forgive me, sir. Mind on other things. A tragedy, you know. Serve wine, Andrews."
Back came Andrews with a glass of wine for Mr. Mansfield, and he talked about Jack defending the dead son against unjust attacks.
Smith longed to cry out, "Ask where Jack used to play as a boy," but the blind man merely listened.
"It's 12 years now," said Andrews, "and still they've not forgiven him for being loved. Still they hate and envy him, as if he will come riding up the drive and snatch some trifle out of the greedy hands. Is it 12 years already, Andrews?"
12 years it was, and Jack had been just 20, with the world before him. And then he'd vanished. Gone into London, it was supposed, and been swallowed up.
"So why can't they let him rest in peace with his father?"
Andrews nodded to the windows and beyond, and the peering belfry seemed to nod back. Yet the yews had a secret air. These yews were not so close together as Smith had at first supposed. There were thin gaps here and there. Was it from these gaps that came the sense of watching?
"I'll leave you now, sir,"
said Andrews, and Smith's desperation grew extreme.
"Mr. Andrews!"
he called. The servant's hand was on the door. He paused.
"Tell us, what was Jack like as a boy?"
"Smith," said the magistrate. But Andrews, for some reason, turned to answer.
"Why, he was well built, very well built, handsome, oh yes, and thoughtful. He was of a thoughtful disposition."
"Were he like me, then?"
"Oh, he was country bred."
"Do you mean he didn't run and climb and play like other lads?" said Smith, who'd done none of these things, save run. "Didn't he have no favourite places to nip into when the going was hot? Didn't he have no little alley or court he could call his own, Mr. Andrews?"
"Smith,"
said the blind man.
"For if he didn't, Mr. Andrews, he weren't a very natural boy."
Andrews, touched on a raw place, answered almost contemptuously,
"Where you, boy, might make a nest in a dirty corner of the wicked town, Jack, when the secret mood was on him, such as comes to all boys who love to dream, would go—"
"Where? Where would he go?" Smith's excitement was intense. So near, so near.
"Smith!"
But Andrews had already crossed the room. Not even the furious magistrate could prevent him defending the dead Jack's quality against the urchin. With wide eyes, Smith watched him. He halted by the window. He pointed, and Smith's blood chilled.
"There was Jack's nest, in yonder churchyard, by the statue of a carved black angel. There."
The footman, Andrews, was gone from the room. Mr. Mansfield had heard him take his leave.
"Smith," he said.
No answer.
"Smith? Smith? Where are you?"
Silence and darkness, deeper than the blind man had ever known it. The boy was gone. He rose to his feet and began, with desperate haste, to feel his way towards the last sound he'd heard, the door closing. He found the door, opened it, and felt cold air blowing in his face. He heard a chandelier jingling as a draught stirred it. He was in the hall. The front door was open.
"Smith!"
he called helplessly, and fell out into the snow. Much shaken, he struggled upright.
"Smith!"
Wretchedly he shook his head, and the snow fell away from his hair.
"Child, come back to me! Smith, I'm frightened. For you. For me. Smith!"
There was no answer, nothing but the restless motion of cold air through unseen shrubs. And then a dog began to bark, then another, and another. Suddenly a hand clutched at his wrist. Smith had come back.
"Where are you dragging me, child?"
"To the churchyard."
"Why, you'll see. Have you forgotten? I'm blind."
"Not that blind, Mr. Mansfield."
Down
Down to the churchyard, with the snow flurrying secretly about them, hurried the boy and the blind man. Still and silent was the little garden where the dead were planted and bloomed in stone. Very prettily did the headstones wear their widows' caps of snow, and stand respectfully in groups and rows. But even in death there was ambition, and a carved black angel knelt upon one tomb, as if to say, "What a special one lies here." Now this angel knelt upon a flat stone to which mounted 3 steps. Upon these steps was a second figure, still enough to be likewise carved, a figure with an easy, familiar air, as if he was come back at last to a place much loved in childhood. The figure of a man with a wooden leg. The blind man suffered himself to be pulled and dragged down till he felt the stone of the church at his back, and heard Smith's voice close in his ear. "He's there, by the statue, pegged up. Little Jack Field, and the spitting image of his done-for pa. It's my Mr. Black. The son? Alive? Yes, more's the pity. It was him what done the old man in. Little limping, whispering Jack. Horrible. Horrible." So now they knew, beyond all doubt, what discovery the old man had made, and sought to take with him to the grave. He had discovered his son was still alive, and that the hope, the golden place in his life, was as wicked and monstrous a morsel of man and wood as stalked and whispered anywhere in the world. To this dreadful thing the document had at last led Smith and Mr. Mansfield, to this one-legged gentleman squatting in the shadow of a carved angel's wing, smiling broodily, with the air of having come by appointment. Now he was looking up. Someone was coming, keeping the appointment. Who'd arranged to meet with Devil? "Here he comes," breathed Smith. "Your friend and mine." For into the churchyard, skipping across the snow with his black coat-tails flapping, like a prosperous bird of prey, came the neat Mr. Billing. "Jack," he called. "Billing." Mr. Mansfield stiffened as if to rise. Grimly, Smith held him back. He would have the magistrate hear all there was to be heard. "The document," said Mr. Billing. "Have you got it?" "No. Our brown friends are not yet come." "Ah, well, it won't be long now, dear Jack." Mr. Billing laid his hand round the other's shoulder. The one-legged man seemed to shiver slightly, as if submitting with an ill grace. "As you say, not long, dear Billing, and we'll be rid of each other." "Why, Jack, we're friends, have been so for years. Why the bitterness now?" "You made me kill him, Billing." "I made you?" Jack, it's not so." "You planned, you urged, you tempted." "Ah, but you acted, Jack. Never forget that." "At last," said the terrible Mr. Black, "we've come." And the yet more terrible Mr. Billing smiled and waved, as from the far end of the churchyard through the quiet yews came the 2 men in brown. Very dark-faced and frozen they were as they approached their employers, but the breeze quickened and their exchanges were partly lost. "Is it the document?" "We've not got it." "Not? Why not? Not killed the blind man, then?" They shook their wicked heads. Mr. Black, grey with terror and rage, raised his hand to strike at them, but Mr. Billing, everyone's friend, stayed his hand and did not free it. Instead, he forced it down and made it point to the snow. What was so remarkable about the snow? Footmarks. There were his own. There, so curious that they chilled Smith's blood when he'd first spied them, were the one-legged man's, and 2 sets more, not to be accounted for, leading through the gate, close by the church wall, to a certain old tree. "They found us,"
said Smith.
We ain't got a chance, Mr. Mansfield.
Slowly the two men in brown turned to peer at the tree. Then a single grin spread over their faces. They began to walk.
"Kill them!" called Mr. Billing. "No help for it. You've got to do it." Could Smith have escaped? In all certainty, yes. He'd the agility, the quickness, the wit, and the terror to vanish from the abominable churchyard before the men had covered half the distance. But not so Mr. Mansfield. The old mole in the hole could never have got further than the gate without a sharp knife in his broad back. So Smith, with all his quickness, wit, and terror, lacked the last ingredient for flight: the will. He was not capable of leaving the blind man behind. Instead, child as he was, he turned to childish weapons for his last defence. With small, trembling fingers he made a snowball, stood up, and, with a loud, defiant shriek, flung it at the nearer of the advancing pair. The man swore, but stopped. His companion, instead of dispatching the boy, laughed. A very costly laugh, that. The seconds thus spent were important. Momentarily the wind puffed up a little storm of snow, and out of it, as if resurrected from under the white ground itself, staggered a formidable figure.
"Stop! Hold! Stand there!"
Cloaked, large, pistoled, stood Lord Tom.
"Spare the boy! I'll not have him armed!"
"You not? And who's you, Lord Piddling Tom? Be off, or we'll slit you in tiny pieces, friend." Lord Tom's face grew angry.
"Smut!" he called. "Never fear! Lord Tom's beside you. I'll save you, lad. I'll blow blue daylight through 'em!"
For a second time the smaller of the two men in brown laughed. He steadied his knife, took a pace forward.
"Blue daylight!"
roared Lord Tom, and fired. A terrible double roar, a terrible double shout, and the man who laughed no more. He was dead, and Lord Tom sank to the ground, a ball inside of him. For Mr. Black had shot him even as he discharged his own pistol. The second fellow, seeing his companion dead, waited no longer. Wildly he rushed away. Then, as the suddenly heartbroken Smith watched, his old hero curiously crossed his pistols upon his chest, where there was a warm, gushing pain.
"Blue daylight, eh, lad?"
They were alone in the graveyard now. Mr. Black had hopped crazily in the wake of his adviser and friend, Mr. Billing. Lord Tom lay with his head on the lowest of the steps, the stone angel brooding above him. Sadly, Smith approached him, leading blind Mr. Mansfield.
"Glad to make your acquaintance, sir,"
said Lord Tom.
"Never thought to. Shake hands. Really an honour."
"And for me, Lord Tom. And for me." Solemnly their hands, guided by Smith, met and grasped, the dying highwayman's and the blind magistrate's. And both were glad of it, for both had reached the end of a journey. For Lord Tom it was the last, but for Mr. Mansfield it was, maybe, his first. A very strange journey, from justice to compassion.
Oh, Duval, Turpin, Robinson, and
Lord Tom,
said Smith, and wept, for his friend was dead. And so by this time was Mr. Black. Andrews had followed him as he leapt and hopped away. He'd taken a fowling piece, caught him this side of Whetstone, and shot him dead. Mr. Black lay like a malformed dark star in the snow, that shadowy, formidable ruin of a good man's son.
Andrews must have stood a great while upon a hillock above the fallen figure, for when the coach occupied by Mr. Leonard the lawyer came towards Prickler's Hill, he was still there, looking to the sky. But of Mr. Billing there was no sign. No one saw him, not anyone in the house, nor Mr. Leonard coming from Barnet, nor Miss Mansfield coming afoot from Whetstone, where Mr. Billing had begged her to remain, as if to spare her from the tragic news he was confident was awaiting, that her father had been murdered on Finchley Common. Later that day, Smith stared through the windows of the house to the widowy yew trees behind which lay his idol, Lord Tom. His snow-stained, tear-stained face came but rarely out of its faraway look to survey the busy drawing-room. When Miss Mansfield came through, Smith did turn and smile compassionately across the room. She'd learnt of Mr. Billing's monstrousness, and the pain and bitterness in her heart was written in her eyes. Quickly she crossed to the window, put her arm about Smith's shoulder, and pressed her cold face to his, so that her dark hair curtained them off in a private night. "Sorry you lost a friend, miss," he said. Then he turned away even from her, to the dark yew trees and the strangely moving whiteness beyond. "Smith," said Mr. Mansfield, who had not left his side. "What did he look like?" Smith sniffed and swallowed hard. "He was a big man, Mr. Mansfield, and always wore green. Green hat, green cloak, green breeches, and he'd bright green eyes as well. He bristled a bit about the chops, but had such a smile on him when he talked to Common that he fair shone. He was a real gallant eye-Toby, Mr. Mansfield. One of the best. He went well, Smith?" "None better, Mr. Mansfield." "He's in heaven, Smith." "Oh, if there's commons up there, that's where he is, Mr. Mansfield. Right up high on the snaffling lay." Mr. Leonard came over and began to talk in low tones to Mr. Mansfield, and Smith's mournful attention drifted away. Then Mr. Mansfield was mentioning his name and handing over the document. Mr. Leonard had come now to the trifle. He'd no wish to visit that spot so soon, but the beneficiaries were eager. "Come, Smith," said Mr. Mansfield, hearing sounds of movement to the door. "Let's see it out." So Smith, still heavy of heart, followed the respectfully hopeful beneficiaries to the sheeted churchyard. Strange occasion. Strange procession. To go to a churchyard in hope. Through the well-remembered little gate they wound, past the rents in the snow to show where the dead man in brown and the mortality of Lord Tom had been decently dragged away. Black and peaceful was the angel, undisturbed at its mysterious devotions, though the world had rocked and rumbled about it. The sexton was fetched from the church, and, under a host of desperate eyes, he began to dig. When he was about a foot into the frozen earth, he stopped and looked up, frowning. "Ah! What have we here?" What had been buried, and not by him? A trifle. A wooden box. A travelling box. "It was his," said Miss Field. I know it. He always used to take it with him to—" "But he's left it behind." "Oh, ma'am," said the sexton, and struck off the strap with his spade. It may be that it's unseemly for beneficiaries to beam and twinkle in a churchyard, even to caper gently in the snow and crowd and shake a lawyer's hand. But in God's name, what else were they to do? Mr. Field's wooden box was filled, stuffed, and glutted with a prosperous lifetime's guineas. Guineas that lay upon guineas in sunny shoals, gleaming and winking in the cold light. The old man must have carried them there in bags which had long since split and sunk under the spreading weight of coinage, for here and there tufts of canvas poked up like threads of cloud in a golden sky. It is night in the Red Lion Tavern between Turnmill Street and Saffron Hill. In the cellar, Miss Fanny and Miss Bridget, reduced to 4 or 5 smoking tallows, are sewing mournfully. Miss Fanny has heard of the death of her admirer and is red-eyed and sniffy. Miss Bridget does not speak, but sighs and shrugs her shoulders from time to time. Their shadows hugely comment on them upon the wall. Suddenly there are certain sounds from above. Miss Bridget frowns and shakes her head. Her great shadow does likewise, as if in agreement. But Miss Fanny puts down her work with an air of presentiment.
It's him.
The door opens. There's a clatter and scuffle. Once more, Smith has missed his footing and fallen down the stairs.
Oh, it's him. He's smart.
Miss Fanny drops her work entirely and bustles to her feet.
And about time, too, says Miss Bridget, looking as stern as she might. Oh, you felonious child, we thought you was shamefully dead.
Now Smith picks himself up, rubs his elbows, the side of his head, and a shin. He squints disparagingly round the cellar, then grandly at his sisters.
Dead?
He says.
What business would I have, being dead, with 10,000 guineas to me name? Answer me that.
He turns to Miss Bridget.
What would you say to a carriage and pair and a house in Golden Square?
Miss Bridget smiles and reaches out to ruffle Smith's head.
I'd say, child, I'd like it very much. When do we move?
Tomorrow, says Smith.
And what would you say to a footman, a maid, and a coachee?
I'd say, very elegant, child. When do we engage them?
Is it possible Miss Bridget is beginning to enjoy the dreaming? Or are her eyes shining only because she's warmed by Smith's generosity even in his dreams?
Tomorrow,
says Smith.
Oh, smart, says Miss Fanny. You are good. Might we have a tall coachman in green livery?
Smith nods in an offhand fashion.
And what would you say to offering me old friend Mr. Magistrate Mansfield of Vine Street a tot of what might warm him against the cold night air?
Miss Bridget smiles.
I'd say it would be an honour, and we'd be very pleased to oblige. When do we invite him?
Now,
says Smith, and shouts,
Come in, Mr. Mansfield. I prepared them. Mind the steps. There's 13.
Upon which Miss Fanny shrieks, and Miss Bridget goes white as her stockings, for the door has opened and the great blind magistrate himself stands incredibly at the head of the stairs. And that was how Smith came home, Smith of the courts and alleys and many a passing pocket, Smith the 10,000 guinea man, for he'd spoke not a halfpenny less than the truth. On the morning at Prickler's Hill, the beneficiary's approval and his own speechless delight, Attorney Leonard had awarded him 1/10 of the churchyard treasure as a mark of gratitude and esteem. 10,000 guineas!
A good round sum,
had said Mr. Mansfield with satisfaction. And what are you going to do with it, Smith? But Smith had answered never a word, for he'd fainted away. How did matters end? Mr. Billing turned King's evidence. He knew where the second murderer in Brown was and was prepared to give him up. Sentenced to 3 years in Newgate jail, he served a month and then fell an odd victim. The old man who dwelt in the fireplace took a strong fancy to him and offered him Smith's old snoozing place. Mr. Billing slept there comfortably till, in one of the old man's dreadful twitchy nightmares, his head was stove in by the old man's chained wrists. Smith, despite his independence of pocket and spirit, stays on in Vine Street. Nothing holds him but affection. Sometimes of a late afternoon a man and a boy go out together and stroll as far as Golden Square, where Smith tells Mr. Mansfield how fine and prosperous a certain establishment is looking these days. Then they go inside it, and Miss Bridget and Miss Fanny are charmed to serve them with chocolate. Gin? The very idea. We are dealing now with ladies. Then they go out again, and Smith looks up at the shop sign with a grin. Miss Bridget and Miss Fanny, court dressmakers. He nudges Mr. Mansfield in the ribs.
Who's to know the court they was makers for was the criminal one at Old Bailey?
From their fine bay window the sisters smile and wave and watch their neat, small brother and his grand and gentle friend walk side by side along the square, till at last they take the corner and are lost from sight. But now the sun goes down and the air darkens. A wind sets in and clouds swing across the sky. Miss Fanny looks out somewhat sadly and dabs at her eyes with a piece of fine lace. She's thinking of Lord Tom and his glittering ways. But then she looks northward and sighs and smiles, for Lord Tom sleeps in a neat grave at the top of Highgate Hill, overlooking the Finchley Common. Nothing would have pleased him better, for from there 'tis but ghosts step to visit Bob's Inn, and go a-riding the night wind with Turpin, Robinson, and Duval. A splendid and gallant company. This audiobook was produced and published by Penguin Books Limited.